Well met, Wanderers, and welcome to part 1 of a planned 9-part series where I will be discussing the writing and general storycraft of Amazon Prime's new Wheel of Time adaptation. The series will be structured with one part focusing primarily on each episode, with the discussion focused on the elements within and how they may relate to other episodes of the show, with the final part being a larger summary of the season as a whole. It is my basic premise that the show is fundamentally broken, and I will be providing references from the show to prove this assertion. Naturally, this means these videos will contain spoilers, as I will be covering each point chronologically and breaking them down as best I can to illustrate concepts and fundamentals of storycraft that I find the show to be lacking on. Using examples from other media as references where applicable, I have put an effort to divorce myself from any personal or subjective feelings I may have about the show in order to offer criticism based solely on its own merits. This is not going to be a series detailing the deviations the show has made from the books, and if this is what you are expecting, then I unfortunately will not be able to help you in this series. I have read the books, but any allusion I make to them during the main body of this series will be in service to my larger goal. As you may expect from an adaptation, there will be plenty of times where the show and the books will share concepts or storylines, and I may make use of the books to help illustrate a point simply because of this similarity. The same way that I may use a scene or concept from another series. Again, the point is to explain why an element within the show is flawed, not to assess the change from the source material directly. I am a firm believer that any piece of media should be able to stand on its own, and an alleged $80 million show from Amazon will not be treated any differently by me. Speaking of which, I am Count ReVamp, an individual who has become increasingly concerned with the state of storytelling, particularly when it comes to modern installments and adaptations of legacy franchises. While I will endeavor to utilize relevant visuals where possible, my primary concern is getting this finished, with a soft second being the security of the video. So to give the video a solid visual throughline, I have elected to use footage from a modded playthrough of Skyrim using the Wheel of Time mod by Almighty SE. Just to help fill the gaps, and a link to the mod will be available in the description. I may explore other visual options in future videos, but for now, this is the deal. With this being my first project of this sort, I cannot say how long the wait will be between parts, though I will do my best to release them as consistently as I can. This will, of course, provide me with the opportunity to redraft and address points and criticisms as we go along, as I'm sure that I will likely miss a few things or make mistakes if for no other reason than the sheer size of this project, and I will make corrections at the beginning of the next part where I can. With all of that said, let us get into the meat of this video, and take a look at episode 1 of Amazon's The Wheel of Time. We begin with a monologue delivered by Moiraine that serves the basic purpose of establishing a few key concepts for the world. That the breaking is an apocalyptic event tied to natural disasters. That a female-dominated society exists and serves some role in preventing or ending the breaking. That this is a world with a system of reincarnation, and the dragon is a person with questionable alignment and has been reborn with our protagonists on a quest to find them. This monologue alone establishes that the show has made serious deviations from the book series in terms of lore and world building. But that alone does not make it bad, and ultimately it isn't, so I won't be discussing the actual words themselves until the show is a bit further along and begins contradicting or undermining the monologue itself. Instead, the main issue with the sequence is now entirely visual. See, this monologue is paired by a rather bland and uninspired showcase of our main female lead getting dressed. I understand the intent is to be like an action superhero suit-up scene, but there isn't a lot here to really dig into. Moiraine is simply getting dressed, and even the addition of seeing her equip daggers and a saw-angreal is meaningless to us as she or the show neither use or explain either until the very end of the series. There isn't any significance or sentiment attached to them by Moiraine or any other character, and instead they just kind of serve as visual filler and are never brought up or referenced again until both become instrumentally necessary for the plot. especially when you consider the possibility that this scene takes place at least 2 years before the rest of the season. Imagine, if you will, Jackson's Lord of the Rings trilogy opening with Gandalf giving the same monologue as Galadriel, but instead of being paired with the visual history of the subject matter, it was simply Gandalf getting dressed. Even if you're interested in seeing how Gandalf trimmed his beard or how he fastened his belt, what does that have to do with the Last Alliance or the Ring's betrayal of Isildur? While on paper Moiraine's monologue is fine, it neglects the importance of film being a visual medium, and the immense value that seeing the breaking of the world, or a sequence with the Aes Sedai picking up the pieces, as Moiraine puts it, would bring to the story. It isn't a question of time or budget either, as they even produced animations to be paired with the show to delve deeper into the world building and lore of the books, and they could have easily done an animation to accomplish the same things as the Lord of the Rings intro. But of course, Jackson's trilogy is only from 20 years ago, so it might be a bit much to compare Wheel of Time to it. So what about another fantasy show? One with a similar budget that was produced only 10 years earlier. Game of Thrones opens with a narratorless prologue about a trio of random men meeting a supernatural and undead foe. It builds tension, suspense, and curiosity as you find yourself wanting to learn more about these monsters and feeling bad for everyone involved. It is a highly effective sequence that serves to establish theme, tone, setting, and threat without a single word of exposition. Even when we move to our main cast of Starks, all the information is provided to us directly through the characterization. We get a good sense, or at least an inkling, of who everyone is and their important relationships through their introductions, and the show just continues to build on to that and deliver information about the setting through the dialogue of the characters. It never stops to have Tyrion or Ned give us a Jackson-inspired narration about Robert's rebellion or the history of the White Walkers and the prophecy of Azor Ahai, and it works really well. Especially considering it's a medieval fantasy centered around political intrigue, where understanding the kingdom and the history of major characters could be important information that a showrunner would want to give to the audience as quickly as possible. Point being that Game of Thrones and Jackson's trilogy have completely opposite approaches to how they introduce their respective worlds and stories, but both are extremely effective and memorable because they are purposeful and play into the broader themes and ideas of their respective series. The choice to have Moiraine do a monologue is perfectly fine, but having her deliver it over a random sequence of her dressing that holds no larger significance or relevance to the story is honestly baffling, and contributes to the common criticism of the show feeling cheap and lazy. With the show's budget, there is no reason why they couldn't have done something with more impact or relevance to the characters or audience. After a momentary fade to black, we are then presented with a sequence featuring two men running away from a threat that turns out to be a group of Red Aes Sedai. We watch as the leader of this group, Liandrin, calls out to the men to pull over. Seeming to refuse, she then reaches out and brings down one of the cliff faces to block the men from escaping through it. She of course does this from a sizable distance while racing on horseback, and shows little strain from the act. The men are knocked to the ground, and the older of the two tells the younger to fight back and to use it, seeming to refer to the magic system of this world. The younger man then turns to face Liandrin and asks her to show his companion mercy. Liandrin is confused by this, and it's revealed that the man has been alone this whole time. Liandrin proceeds to dismount and casually approach the clearly distressed man who she just referred to as insane, in order to establish her power level, and the other four Aes Sedai just casually remain on their horses. After a brief world-building exchange, Liandrin then proceeds to gentle the man as Moiraine watches from afar. Right off the bat, we are presented with a handful of issues that serve to demonstrate the overall quality of writing that we can expect from this show. Obviously, the writers wanted to achieve something with this scene, such as establishing Liandrin and the Red Aja as potential antagonists with an action sequence. But it's hard to imagine much more thought being put into it beyond that, and this is compounded by the fact that both Moiraine and the show itself also seems to have forgotten this scene entirely by the time it leaves our screens. More on that later, but for now, let's focus on the actual elements here. First is an issue of setup and investment. I have no idea how the characters have ended up in this scenario, or even that they existed before the director called action. Basic questions such as how long has this chase been going on, or why does it take the Aes Sedai so long to actually stop him? How is this one man able to outrun 5 horses? Did he use magic to evade capture? That doesn't seem likely, seeing how reluctant he is to use it when his back is to the wall. They are also running on a well-used road and not through thickets or over hills to evade the horses, which would imply that the chase has only just begun. But does that mean that Red Aja just happened to bump into this guy on the road? There's no sign of any village or town nearby, so does he live by himself? This is important because how would the Aes Sedai, including Moiraine and Lan, even know he can touch the source if they just randomly ran into him or he lives alone? Moiraine says in episode 4 that women can't even see men's weaves.
I mean, I always knew women couldn't see men's weaves, but the experience itself is...
So how do any of them know that he can channel? Why are the sisters even out here? Did the Amyrlin send them? Does this take place before the Amyrlin sent them to deal with Loghain? If it's after, where are the Green Sisters? Are the Red Aja just randomly running around the countryside looking for male channelers? Does the Amyrlin know that they are? Would she care? Surely the Blue Aja would know about this if they were. It seems like a pretty big deal to gentle a man without trial, and the Blue Aja would have plenty of reason to bring it up. Don't mistake me. I'm not saying that the show needed to devote time to this character we never see again to answer these questions, though it absolutely could have given the time it wastes on other pointless characters. What I'm working to establish is that this sequence begins and ends with what's on screen. These characters did not exist before we saw them, and they cease to exist as soon as we stop watching them. Have you ever heard the phrase living, breathing world in reference to a fictional story, and in particular a fantasy story? It is one of the main draws of fantasy, and something that serves to invest us as readers and watchers in the story and attach us to characters. We want to believe in its authenticity. In the real world, your coworker or a car passing you on the street doesn't disappear from reality the moment that you stop looking at it. The world keeps turning, or the wheel keeps weaving. But that is not the case in this show, and as soon as a character or a setting leaves our sight, they disappear as completely as this guy does. And if they are fortunate enough to reappear, they do so without having experienced the passing of time. It is really hard to get a sense of scale or permanence in this show. Characters seem to teleport to where they need to be with no regard as to how they would have gotten there or any experiences they would have had along the way. But let's move on. As I said before, why is Liandrin so casually approaching this guy? I'm not going to dive into the magic system too much in this part. Suffice it to say that the show is being really inconsistent on how they portray it. But Liandrin is making no effort to actually protect herself from a potential attack. Her fellow Aes Sedai are sitting back casually on their horses some distance away. We have no idea for sure whether or not Liandrin and the sisters would even be able to see if this guy was channeling. But even if they could, as Liandrin seems to suggest, why are they not shielding him? We know this is possible. Why are they wasting time talking to him anyways? Does Liandrin just want to gloat? She's under the impression that this guy is already insane. Surely they would be a bit cautious. Liandrin seems to begin gentling this guy as soon as she's done, and it's only after she starts that the other sisters even begin to dismount. This implies that it was part of the plan the entire time, to gentle him, that is. There's nothing to suggest that any of the other 4 sisters are surprised or concerned by this. They're all on board and just waiting for Liandrin to start. None of them are concerned about Tower Law or potential repercussions from the Amyrlin. An Amyrlin that was raised from the Blue Aja that they would have every reason to believe would crack down on them. What happens after this? Do they just let this guy go? This would imply that they aren't sanctioned to be hunting him, but we're told that gentled men still go mad. So they're effectively killing this guy if they are just leaving him. And the little we know about these 5, it seems unlikely that they would even bother to take him to a nearby village. So far, the show has not established a critical element of Liandrin's character, so we're left to assume that she doesn't directly kill this guy, besides which doing so would cause problems since Moiraine is watching. There's also the small matter of the cliff face that Liandrin collapsed to block off this guy's escape. This seems like a well-used road, and they collapsed what seems to be a direct path through the mountain. Do they then spend time cleaning it up? If there is a village nearby, surely they would be able to connect the collapse to the Red Aja, and allow the Blue Aja to know about it and everything else that transpired here. I would like to note that despite the show's budget, we don't actually see Liandrin use her magic. We see the results of it, sure, but every time we should be able to see her weave, we are instead just given a close-up of her face and then see the result. This only makes sense if we are supposed to be watching from the perspective of the guy who, in theory, can't see Liandrin's weaves, but we're not. Guess they ran out of money for the second sequence of the show. And then there's Moiraine. How did she and Lan even get there in time to watch this? Were they following the chase from the cliff? Why are they dismounted? Did Moiraine know they would end up here? What is she waiting for? Would she have only believed this guy was the dragon if he had fought back? If she thinks there's a chance he is, why isn't she attempting to help him escape? She absolutely thinks that the dragon could be caught and gentled, or she wouldn't be keeping her mission secret from the Aes Sedai to begin with. So why is she just watching? Moiraine then says that there are 4 ta'veren in the 2 rivers. I'm sorry, what? Honestly, divorce yourself from the books and ask, what is a ta'veren in the show? There are 2 possible answers to that question at this point. First is that ta'veren is a word used for possible dragons. Moiraine does say this to counter Lan right after we watch someone she thought was a dragon be gentled. There can't be anything more important about a ta'veren than this guy, because Moiraine already knows about the 2 rivers ta'veren, but she chased him down first, which would imply some kind of connection between the 2 and suggest this guy was also ta'veren. Another possible answer is that ta'veren refers to a place, as in ta'veren are people who come from the city of Ta'vere, and that place has recently fallen. And so the presence of 4 people from Ta'vere in the 2 rivers is an oddity that Moiraine thinks is worth looking into. Evidence for this interpretation would come from how Moiraine immediately follows this by talking about the Old Blood, and later questions Nynaeve about her origin, and setting up the idea that the dragon wouldn't naturally be born in the 2 rivers. If you are familiar with the books, you of course know what a ta'veren actually is. But the show doesn't explain anything, and drops the concept entirely as soon as Moiraine finishes saying the word until the very end. No matter what ta'veren are in this universe, there has ultimately been no explanation as to what they are or how you identify them. The show presents the idea that the 2 rivers is at least marginally isolated. Who would have identified 4 ta'veren in a minuscule village, and spread the idea around enough that Moiraine would know about them? Are no other Aes Sedai interested in visiting the 2 rivers to find these ta'veren? Is this something Moiraine casually picked up on the road, or did she get this from the spy networks the Blue Aja are implied to have? That would make sense, I suppose, since Lan seems unaware of it. But would no other Blue Sisters be curious about it? We know that Moiraine isn't sanctioned by Mygan, who is able to learn about Taran Ferry. Are we to believe that the Blue Aja network extends literally into the 2 Rivers region, but either doesn't know or doesn't care about ta'veren, even if they are only rumors? Not to mention that if there's a connection between them and the dragon as Moiraine suggests, why is a group of Red Aja not heading there? Is this the reason why Liandrin is gentling this guy? Lan lays out a compelling list of connections this guy has to the dragon. Is Liandrin's group aware of this as well? Is she also hunting the dragon reborn? Does she know that he's ta'veren, or is this just a random guy? Does Moiraine see that he's in fact not ta'veren, and that's what convinces her he's not the dragon? We never even get an answer as to which of the 5 are the ta'veren Moiraine is referring to, or if they already know that they are. Fain reveals in episode 8 that all 5 of them are ta'veren, so which are the 4 she already knows about? From a writing perspective, it seems to serve the purpose of explaining why Moiraine goes to the 2 rivers while referencing a concept from the books. But it is lazy and contrived as an explanation and dropped from any greater narrative within the show, in spite of the massive implications it would have on the story, and how easily it can be misconstrued by a modern audience if explained as half-heartedly as so many other key concepts from the books. As another side note, Moiraine also says she hopes the Old Blood has prepared them for what's coming. What is coming? Why would Moiraine say this? Does she already know that the Trollocs are going to be attacking the 2 rivers? She doesn't even know about the Fade, and is surprised by the Trollocs even being there. Is she referring to the dragon fighting the Dark One? Is she so confident that the dragon is in the 2 rivers? If she is, why hasn't she already gone there? Is this something she says to Lan before every outing? Did she hope that the old blood prepared this guy for what's coming as well? The camera then pans up as they ride away to show us a ruined city from the Age of Legends, and recontextualize the entire show in the apocalyptic event of the breaking for any viewer who noticed. Following this, we get a couple shots of the women's circle of the two rivers traveling some distance for Egwene's welcoming ceremony into the circle. And it's our first decent scene of the show. We are introduced to our secondary protagonist of Egwene, and the village wisdom Nynaeve. Logistically, the scene works well. It gives us a glimpse at some of the ceremony and structure of the two rivers. There is some form of governing body called the Women's Circle, and the braid is a symbol of this body that seems to be tied to a coming-of-age ceremony. I do find it a little weird that it's not Egwene's mother doing the braid instead of this random girl. And before anyone says it in the comments, there is nothing to suggest that Egwene's four sisters survived the adaptation process. Nynaeve gives Egwene a speech about womanhood before pushing her into the river. Egwene surrenders to it and flows with it until she reaches a bank and returns to the shore. There's some neat symbolism here, particularly as references to the books. And my only real question is about if everyone just kind of hopes she survives. Like, she gets pretty beaten up by this. I get the impression that the women's circle just head back and wait for Egwene to return, with no one meeting her at the bank. But I believe the intent is to show the sturdiness of Two Rivers women, and visualize Egwene's journey through the show as someone who will fight to keep her head above the water, but ultimately doesn't fight the current and will go where she feels the river is pulling, or something. Cutting from Egwene, we get a snippet of Rand and Tam as they follow a winding trail down the mountainside. Things seem to be looking up for the show as we are presented with another scene that is structurally sound. We get some light bonding between Rand and Tam and learn that Rand is a potential love interest for Egwene. All in all, it's a fine scene that doesn't stick around long enough to break anything, which is probably for the best, as seeing the wonderful Michael McElligott for more than 5 seconds will only remind me of better times. We begin to get a feel for the fast pace the first few episodes will have as we cut again to some establishing shots of the two rivers. And watch as Tam and Bran carry casks of brandy into the Winespring Inn, and we get a general sense of merriment with reference to Bel Tine, which we can assume is some sort of village festival and a religious exercise in the same vein as the Day of the Dead or Easter. We then rejoin Rand and are introduced to two more of our secondary characters, those being Mat and Perrin, and we are immediately dropped back into the pit of lazy and bad writing. See, Mat is gambling at a table with Rand, Perrin, a character named Danya, and a couple other faceless people. We get the sense that Mat is a bit of a showman, and he loses the role. This prompts Danya to take the money, and she and the other faceless characters all leave the table. They even leave the food and drink that we know they paid for.
Come on, man. We're losing a point for every empty hand.
To wander through a packed inn just so we can have our characters have a moment alone. This is an unnatural way to get the boys by themselves. Moiraine or Bran don't come by to clean the table, and no one returns or any new people sit down just because the script needs this table to be empty now. Rand tells us that Mat is broke, and Mat attempts to sweet-talk the two into another gamble. Perrin's response to this is that he and Rand were in the middle of a conversation, and we're presented with the dialogue version of Liandrin's confusing setup earlier. Perrin and Rand are having a conversation at the same table that Mat is gambling at, and Perrin suggests that Mat interrupted them with his game. Soon after, Perrin asks Rand how much money Mat lost. Rand replies that he's lost count, and we know that Rand has been at this table for some time, as evidenced by Rand being on his second mug and Perrin his third. So Mat's been running at least a few games at this table. And if he's played at others, why would Perrin have expected Rand to know? Rand even asks Mat how he and his sisters are, which would imply this is the first time Rand has talked to Mat today. Not to mention that he has supposedly been talking to Perrin. After shooting Mat down, Perrin asks Rand if he's heard the news about the war, and Rand implies he hasn't and allows Perrin to inform us that there's a war going on to set up Loghain in the later episodes. It's implied that this is what Perrin and Rand had been talking about before Mat arrived. but this is clearly the first time Perrin's brought up the subject. It's far from uncommon for a story to want to drop us directly in the middle of a setup, be it action or a conversation, to show us there are events and stories happening that we can infer, and in most stories it works well. The struggle is making sure that if you're doing this, your writing can support the audience by naturally giving them the inferences to piece together. Having your character imply that a conversation has progressed off screen only for them to reset and deliver the conversation fresh with the character they had already supposedly had this conversation with is lazy and stilted, especially when you frame it around the idea that the conversation had been interrupted by a third character, who also doesn't seem to know about the information. Is it a bit typical? Yes, but Matt implies he hasn't heard about the war, so why would you not write the dialogue around Matt's ignorance instead of Rand's? Or have Rand be the one to interrupt the setup after he helps Tam with the barrels instead of already being 2 mugs deep before Tam's even finished unloading. That way you can still use Rand's isolation as a vehicle for delivering information to the audience. But then again, that might mean giving Rand a redeeming characteristic, and we wouldn't want that, now would we? They want to communicate that there's a war going on to the audience, but they give it to us in the most direct way possible, not utilizing the characters and setting effectively to do so. And if it wasn't for the delivery by a competent cast, this dialogue would feel like those conversations 2 NPCs would have in Oblivion.
It's you. Hi.
I understand the Fighters Guild is hiring new members. Not bad work for some
It
folks.
seems Somerset
So
has
I've heard.
become a much more
Go
dangerous
away,
place.
fool.
Oh, if that's the way you feel.
Great.
Which is especially sad for the lines that are effective or clever. I'll take this moment to pause and remind you that my purpose here is to provide as thorough a critique and analysis of the show's writing as acutely as I can. I will make mistakes, or perhaps my arguments will not be as articulate as they need to be to thoroughly represent a flaw in the show's writing. This is fine, and I will attempt to correct this as I go. But it is also important to note that while a flaw is a flaw, not all flaws are created equal. Some problems are bigger than others, and the degree to which any of the things I present bother you or your enjoyment of the media in question is up to you. What I just said about the laziness of Perrin's dialogue, I imagine, does not bother a lot of people. But my intention in highlighting it as I have is to help build a larger argument about how the writers have chosen to relay information, and I see this as a problem that exists throughout the show. Characters say things that should already be said. They say things they should not have said and deliver things in ways that a normal person wouldn't, which I find to degrade the show's quality and add to the sense of cheapness that a lot of people have already been talking about in regard to the show. Hopefully I will succeed in this by the end of the series, but for now I am simply presenting what I have found, and you can, of course, do what you want with it. And if you are here looking for more substantial criticism, I assure you there is plenty. And as the series goes on, I will be highlighting larger and larger inconsistencies, contrivances, and the dreaded plot holes as we put more mileage on the show. So, what does Perrin tell us about the war in Ghealdan?
A few folks went down to Tarrant Ferry with the wall last week. Town was full of soldiers and mercenaries headed south.
Why?
They said there's a war in Ghealdan.
Okay, let's lay a little groundwork here. Another argument that I will be presenting is the inconsistency of the physical world. Geography, in terms of scale and distance, are extremely contradictory as the show progresses. Perhaps in the later episodes I will attempt to actually chart out the map of this world, but for now let's look at what we have to work with. During Moiraine's Batman and Robin suit-up scene, she actually does look at a map that she carries with her. This is important because from this brief glimpse we can line up this map with that of the Wetlands, or the Westlands as you may prefer from the books. While I'm unable to read the actual landmarks on Moiraine's map, we can see that the general shape of the subcontinent is largely the same, such as this being Altara, with the peninsula that Ebudar is on, the islands of Tremalking. This would be Tanchico, and Falma would be just up here, and Bandar Iban just beyond that. We can see Lake Samal here, which would make this little circle Berlon, and this region is the 2 rivers. If we follow this road down, we get Whitebridge, and the last one I would like to point out is this circle as being Javanna, the capital of Ghealdan. Amazon also has an interactive map that follows the events of the show and confirms they are trying to use the same map as the books. But I wanted to establish that this map is within the show itself. With all that in mind, let's begin our dissection. Perrin says that a few folks went down to Tarn Ferry and that the town was full of soldiers who were on their way south to Gildon. So did Perrin actually just imply that Tarn Ferry is south of the two rivers? Why does he say go down? He must just be referring to elevation, maybe. But if Tarn Ferry is still to the north, how can it be full of soldiers on their way to Gildon? If you head south of Tarn Ferry, you'd end up in the two rivers. The road seems to pass right by the town, so why wouldn't there be any soldiers in the village? Moiraine's map even seems to suggest a road that would lead from the two rivers to south of Whitebridge, so where are the soldiers? We know Baerlon exists in the show, so why is this not where soldiers are gathering to make their way to Gildon? In the books, the villages of the two rivers are cradled in natural barriers. Mountains, rivers, forests, and marshes that serve to isolate them from most any approach except from the north, and serves as an explanation of why wars and affairs in Gildon have such little effect on them, despite being physically rather close. The closest we get to that in the show is Mat blowing off the idea of war in Gildon and the lack of concern the adults show when cleaning up later. So inferring that it is similarly difficult to travel from the two rivers to Gildon, why are soldiers and mercenaries heading south from Baerlon to get to Tarn Ferry but haven't carried on south to the two rivers? Or once they reach Tarn Ferry, do they turn around because they're told they've gone the wrong way? This doesn't make any sense with the information we have, and making Perrin say it just so you have book fans go, "Ooh, they mentioned Tarn Ferry, I know that place," isn't good writing. I will also be bookmarking the Tarn Ferry as a town and full of soldiers comments for when we get to episode 2. Following some genuinely good acting from Barney Harris, we see that the woman from earlier, Danya, is just standing off to the side, oogling Mat. Mat gets up to talk to her, and it's implied that he intends to steal her bracelet to solve his money problems. And once more, I need to slam the brakes. I get that the purpose of this is to show that Mat isn't a morally upstanding character, but is it also the intent to make him stupid as well? Danya is the same character who won all of Mat's money literally 1 minute ago. Why would he want to steal her bracelet instead of the money that he just lost? We don't have an exact reference for what marks are in the show, but Rand and Perrin give Mat 3 coins later for the lanterns that we know are half a mark. Point being, there should be plenty in the pile that Danya won that he could take from to use on the lanterns, which would be far less noticeable over a bracelet. If both Rand and Perrin don't know how much money was in that pile, surely Danya wouldn't be certain either. And it's been less than a minute. She has to still have the coins on her if she's spent the time getting another drink and waiting for Mat to notice her. Which brings us to the second point. Why is Danya just standing to the side? She had a place at the table and seemed friendly with the boys who she undoubtedly had grown up around in this minuscule village, and directly interested in Mat. I get playing coy with them, but hours later? You remember what I said earlier about characters not existing if they're off screen? Mat and Danya stay in this same spot for hours, and Mat still hasn't even gotten the bracelet off of her. They don't find seats together, they don't wander out. Mat gets up to talk to her and then they literally just stay there. They even flip the shot to make it look like they had moved. I'm not kidding, it's flipped. Danya's bracelet has switched wrists and her ring swapped hands. Mat's hair is parted to the other side and his moles are on the opposite sides of his face. And why would Mat steal from a girl who's interested in him anyways? And something as obvious as a valuable bracelet. The village seems like a really small community of 100 people max. And we can gather that Mat has a reputation of being more dubious, and this isn't the first time he's stolen. It's unclear when or how exactly he did steal the bracelet, but it wouldn't be longer than the next morning until Danya realized it was missing, and she would surely immediately suspect Mat of having taken it. It's also questionable about why he doesn't just ask for enough coin to buy the lanterns anyways. Danya is interested in him, and I find it hard to believe that this Mat wouldn't try to sweet-talk a seemingly well-off girl into taking pity on him and his sisters on an important holiday. To be clear, I'm not doubting Matt's ability to steal the bracelet. I'm questioning his decision to. Nynaeve and Egwene then enter the inn with much revelry, and we get a shot of Rand smiling at Egwene. Egwene seems to notice Rand and looks away, and we have a reaction shot of Perrin smiling back at her before her father comes up to express his worry and congratulations in what is overall a generally good moment. Her father is then sidestepped as Egwene is pulled away by Dae's Conger, and Rand is upset that she didn't seem to really even notice him. We then jump forward a night to set as a storm starts rolling in. Rand's a bit mopey as Egwene serves patrons, and she gives him a conflicted look that tells us something is on her mind. And Perrin reveals his power level as he blinks in and out of reality and teleports next to Rand without anyone noticing. Here he is next to Tam, then he's gone, then he's back, then he appears next to Rand. Continuity sure is a beautiful thing. After warping reality, Perrin asks Rand how Egwene's ceremony went, which strikes me as a bit odd. You'd think that being married to Layla, he would know they're not supposed to talk about the ceremony, and he'd probably also know if Rand and Egwene had talked at all that night. You know, given Perrin's rampant jealousy that the show presents us in the last half of the season. Their conversation is interrupted, however, as Lan enters the inn, and the confusion only grows. Honestly, what is with the awkward silence entrance? The inn goes silent as soon as Lan enters, but why? This is an active festival with people feasting and drinking late into the night. Yet they all go silent as soon as the door opens. Are you telling me that no one has left or arrived since Egwene? No one's gone home or had to use the pot before coming back? Is no one even the mildest bit drunk? It's baffling the reaction that Lan gets. They go silent before any of them would even have seen him. And even if it's just the whole, a dark, hooded figure thing, it's actively raining and you're all in an inn. Why would you not assume that it's someone from one of the farms coming in to celebrate Bel Tine? We know not everyone who lives in the village is here, and even if he's a stranger, so? You're in an inn, which strikes me as the ideal place for someone traveling to go. And I can't stress enough that they are literally holding a festival, and it's borderline insulting that the show expects me to believe that this is how a room full of country folk, hours into feasting and drinking, would react to someone opening the front door. The only thing about Lan that would draw any attention would be his sword. But as we went over earlier, the next village over is full of soldiers and mercenaries. Not to mention that we know the roads are more dangerous than they used to be due to wolves. And Two Rivers folk travel armed. Even Nynaeve is armed. And that's being overly generous to the show anyways. No attention is given to Lan's sword or that there's any apprehension about weapons of any kind in the Two Rivers. Even Tam's sword that would, in theory, have actual relevance to plot and character receives no special acknowledgement or recognition from anyone. But Lan could just be a soldier from Tarn Ferry who actually made his way south. Rand even comments about this.
Maybe she's headed to the war in the south.
Moiraine's entrance is equally contrived. There is no other explanation than theatrics to explain both Moiraine and Lan's entrance. Moiraine and Lan sat outside in the rain and planned what they were going to do, and I find myself cringing at the thought. They even give Lan an
epic removes hood because I'm a bad boy moment.
And Moiraine gets a blur effect as she comes into focus so that we know that they're totally awesome and this is all incredibly out of place. Honestly, why do Lan and Moiraine not just enter at the same time? This is an intentional choice by two characters who, according to the show, are supposed to be focused, direct, and competent. And I can't think for the life of me why either of these characters would behave this way. And if you want the record scratch, why not have it be when Moiraine flashes her ring and Moiraine calls her an Aes Sedai? That seems like it would be a far more appropriate moment for the room to get quiet. Surely this isn't for the audience. This feels like it should have been our introduction to Lan and Moiraine, but did they forget that we've already met them? Unlike in the books, we've already spent time with these two. We know what their mission is, and we already knew they were going to show up here. This pretense at mistrust is completely out of place, and feels like they shot this before they decided to make Moiraine the protagonist. For some reason, Nynaeve is the first one who addresses Lan, instead of either of the innkeepers, compounding what I'd just said moments ago. And why does Moiraine treat Nynaeve so coldly as she beelines to Moiraine? She's all warm smiles and thank yous to Moiraine, and I'm not sure what the point of the dead stare she throws to Nynaeve is. In later episodes, the show makes no attempt at portraying the Aes Sedai with the serenity and aloofness that they have in the books. And the only characters Moiraine ever treats this way are the 5 people that she should absolutely want to be the warmest towards. More on that later, I suppose. And why does Moiraine so casually declare herself an Aes Sedai? This seems to be a world where, outside of Tar Valon, Aes Sedai are both actively hated, mistrusted, and outright hunted. There's even a stronger reaction to her being an Aes Sedai here than when Rand, Mat, Perrin, and Egwene are told that they could be the Dragon Reborn. It's an odd decision, Moiraine, and one that seems like it would likely do more harm to your mission than good. After all, male channelers are actively hunted, as we saw only a few minutes ago, and there's a good chance that the dragon is a male channeler who's old enough to have started developing the ability to channel. If you go around advertising that an Aes Sedai is in town, wouldn't it likely scare them away, making it harder to find them and ultimately convince them you don't mean them harm? And the same would probably be true of a female dragon as well, whether or not they would fear being severed. But Moiraine knows what she's doing and immediately hones in on our secondary characters. Not sure why, is it because they're the only 20-somethings in the place? Even though we know Nynaeve is much older than what Moiraine expects, it can't be the ta'veren thing she mentioned before as she looks at the 5 of them. Who even are the ta'veren? The 3 boys would have to be, otherwise she wouldn't have reason to take them. So is she seeing Nynaeve as ta'veren and just sensing the channeling potential of Egwene? Can Moiraine even identify a ta'veren no matter what it is? I'm sure we'll get answers to all of this in time. I do think it's worth noting that there is a clever framing where as Moiraine looks at Nynaeve, Lan is in frame, hinting at their eventual romance. Just those small little details that remind you of the potential of the show. As Moiraine and Lan are led off to their room, Nynaeve, presumably concerned by the arrival of these strangers, subtly urges Perrin to check in on his absent wife. In response to this, Perrin just looks at Egwene and awkwardly asks Nynaeve to give her his best. And Nynaeve gives a weird look in response, like she's conflicted or remorseful about something. Of course, with episode 7, we know there's a bit of unrequited love between Perrin and Egwene. There's been quite a few of these moments of Perrin just watching Egwene or avoiding her. In the same way that Nynaeve and Lan were just framed, Egwene, Rand, and Perrin were also framed, with Perrin even being pushed to the back behind Rand, setting up a love triangle as we follow Perrin to the forge and are introduced to his wife, Layla. Layla has been working the forge alone, and seems to be upset about something. Layla didn't go to Egwene's ceremony, and the mention of Egwene seems to further distress her, telling us that she is fully aware of her husband's feelings for another woman, and probably the event that actually prompted Perrin to propose in the first place. Perrin takes hold of her and says that he loves her, and she gives what comes across to me as a half-hearted and vulnerable I know, which serves to cement the idea that Layla is Perrin's rebound girl. This idea of a loveless marriage is interesting, and I hope that they can pull it off tactfully without making Perrin into a bigger jerk than he already is. After all, Perrin has been at the inn all day drinking and feasting and doesn't bother to even be sure his wife of who knows how long is okay until Nynaeve prompts him. This isn't bad writing on its own, but it's really complicated subject matter and can be really messy to introduce one of your protagonists as an uncaring partner. It's something you can mess up really easily and turn your audience against the character, especially if it's unintentional on the writer's part. While I'm open to the possibilities, given the current political and social climate of the, quote, modern audience the show is being adapted for, I do question the decision to give a storyline about a failed marriage and anger issues to your one black male lead. But beyond that, Helena Westerman gives a great performance, and hers is the most the show has been able to tug on my heartstrings over the series. We then catch up with Matt as he is walking around the side of the inn. Last we saw him, he was still inside with Danya, so we can assume he has acquired the bracelet. It has since stopped raining and seems to be weirdly dry for how much it had been. And I suppose the idea is that Matt went home, but his parents weren't there, so he went out looking for them and finds them both back at the inn that he just left. But wait, he even implies that he doesn't know where his sisters are, but we know that they are just home. so he didn't go home. Then why is he approaching the inn from the direction of his home, as evidenced by him dragging his mother back the way he just came? And how would he have ended up here without noticing his parents? Mat thought his mother was with his sisters, so why is she drunk? Did she go to the inn after he left? Why is he coming back if not to look for them, yet seems surprised to find them? Okay, is the pattern becoming clear? But Mat notices his mom obscured by a stone pillar before he notices his father standing out in the open, even illuminated by the light of the inn. And here's where I would like to remind you that the Two Rivers seems to be at most a couple dozen buildings and 100 or so people. As Mat's mom, who is the only person in the Two Rivers who doesn't seem to be able to hold her liquor, stands about, 20 feet away from her husband, who is implied to openly be having affairs. Mat's dad, or the girl he's flirting with, don't seem to care or notice the obviously disheveled and drunk woman standing mere paces away. They don't even react as Mat drags her off kicking and wailing. Is there some kind of weird free use thing going on here? I know the showrunners have a fetish for polyamory, but is this literally what's happening? This village is too small for people not to know who the Cothans are, especially as they seem to be the destitute family. The show even tells us that every girl we see with a braid is part of the women's circle, which would include the one Mat's dad is flirting with. There's no way she doesn't know. So is the village just full of sluts and homewreckers? The women's circle is the only form of authority we're told about in the Two Rivers. Is this acceptable for them? Is this how the show wants to portray matriarchy? I have no clue. But the scene comes to a close with Mat putting his mother to bed as she calls him a womanizer, which hurts Mat before he and his sister settle down for the night. With Perrin and Mat both safely tucked away before the rain returns, we then check in on Rand and Egwene as they help to clean up after the long night of festivities. And Moiraine delivers a line that serves the dual purpose of telling us that a conversation has been happening off-screen while catching the audience up on the topic and general tone of that conversation. It proves that the writers are aware and capable of pulling this off, and I can't help but wonder where this was during the earlier conversation about the war. Of course, they probably just happened to luck into a decent setup, considering this is another line pilfered from its context in the books, and the seeming inability to replicate its basic success later on. The best way I can think to describe this scene is that it all feels like a stage play. Everything is a little stilted when it comes to blocking and delivery. The actors are clearly reciting lines and stiffly following blocking, waiting for their cues to give their lines or exit. It doesn't flow naturally, and there isn't clear direction beyond get the scene done. Let's take a look at Tam's line as an example. He plays off Moiraine's line to let us know that they're discussing not just the rumors of war, but what Moiraine might have to do with them specifically. Well and good, but take a look at his blocking. Tam is carrying dirty dishes to put on the table when he stops to look at Moiraine and deliver his line. This allows him to deliver the line facing the camera. However, Moiraine is walking just off frame to behind the counter where Bran is doing dishes. And Tam seems to switch to addressing Egwene as she passes by him to stand on the opposite side of the dirty dishes table. Tam, however, does not move. He continues to deliver his line facing the camera despite everyone he would be talking to, as well as his prop target being upstage of him. Or, he crosses from upstage left to the front of the stage to deliver his line. Meanwhile, the other two actors cross downstage right as they don't have speaking lines and we want the audience to focus on Tam. After Tam finishes his line, he falls into a 1,000-yard stare, which I guess helps explain why he's not turning to address the other characters instead of the audience. Except Tam still has to deliver one more line in order for Bran to meet his cue.
Aes Sedai don't fight wars. They pull the strings of the world from the White Tower.
Is a complete thought, and Tam follows it with silence. No one says anything because they're just waiting for Tam to finish his line. It doesn't flow like a conversation would, especially given the subject matter. You can even watch as Rand in the background just looks and waits, walking backwards as Tam stares in silence. And as soon as he starts speaking again, Rand turns to finish his blocking.
And if one of them's here,
then she'll enjoy Bel Tine tomorrow like the rest of us.
Unlike his previous line, this isn't a complete statement, and could just as easily be the start of a larger point on Tam's part, as much as it is an implication. But it's only after Tam says this, and not the pause beforehand, that Bran decides to interject and end the discussion. Despite Moiraine speaking with passion on the subject mere seconds ago, she's not allowed to engage anymore. She did move off screen after all. The show has its secondary protagonists and a prominent secondary character present in the scene, but they are also both forced to remain silent. Why do we not get to explore our main characters? Why does Rand not interject with a line about how anyone who lets an Aes Sedai pull their strings would be a fool, allowing Egwene to tease him,
"Perhaps she's already pulling yours then."
And Bran closes the conversation with,
Whatever her reasons, I hope she enjoys Bel Tine as much as the rest of us.
Now, I'm not a screenwriter with a multi-million-dollar budget, but the point of this isn't to rewrite the show. After all, if you want a better written version of the show, you can just read the books. But I want to point out that for all her screen time, we haven't heard Egwene talk at all. And this implied silence between them is extremely weird. We've been told that these two characters are longtime friends and even intimate. We know that Egwene isn't mad at him and that she's just conflicted about the choice of becoming a wisdom. So why has she been ghosting him? These two have been in the same small room for hours at this point, and they haven't said a single word to each other? Has Rand attempted to talk to her? Every time we see her look at him, it's remorseful, so we know she already made her decision. Why does she suddenly switch to playful when they're alone? Why doesn't she ever tell him she needs to talk to him about something important? It also feels really weird when the parents all leave. First, Tam has just enough time to set his plates down before the camera cuts and he is teleported to a void dimension where the writers put everything that's not actively on scene. He just kind of vanishes. And the same thing with Bran and Moiraine. They move from behind the counter to ask Rand and Egwene to finish the dishes, and then they just walk off screen. Now, the idea that the parents can see something is up between the two and want to give them some alone time is perfectly fine, but I don't get any parental bonds. There's not even a simple good night. Bran just stands awkwardly next to Moiraine and follows her in a very high school stage play. I don't have any more lines, so I just need to walk off stage kind of way. He doesn't say anything, no I love yous, no I'm so proud, nothing. He doesn't look at Rand or Egwene, he doesn't hug or kiss Egwene, he just kinda stands there with a genuine look of confusion on his face. Like he's trying to remember his next cue as he waits to follow Moiraine off screen. He even looks down at his feet when he leaves. The writers wanted the two to be alone, but didn't care if it happened organically. Instead, Tam just disappears without a word, and Egwene's parents turn into script robots in order to get off the screen. That's not even to mention the logistics of where the Alvirs go. It makes sense for Tam and Rand's rooms to be upstairs, that's where Moiraine and Lan are. But we know that Egwene's room is through the double doors behind the counter, and it would make sense for her parents to live in the attachment as well. It's hard to tell, but when they do leave, it doesn't seem like we hear them go upstairs, but rather that we hear the sounds of a door open and close. So did they just go outside to go the long way to get in the attachment? Why could they not have just gone through those doors? Is it because the set isn't fully built and there's not anything on the other side? It feels like at any given moment they only do enough blocking to get a character off screen, with no regard to if it makes sense in the world space or the narrative. It makes the characters feel hollow and robotic despite generally solid acting, and the world feels cheap and fake. The scene then progresses towards Rand and Egwene's romance. This is the first time we've heard Egwene talk, let alone say anything to Rand, and Rand has spent the whole episode moping about Egwene not talking to him. There's apparently an active conflict between the two, but the first time we see them actually interact, we have to bypass any development or resolutions because they're young, and that makes them horny or something. Remember, kids, sex is always a good substitute for low moral character and solutions to your problems. After all, this is a realistic and mature show, which only serves to beg the question of why. Now, I'm not here to discuss whether or not it makes sense for this world to have modern sexual values, or break down the effect this change has in relation to the book version of these characters. Rather, I am here to discuss writing, and this is quintessentially lazy writing as far as I'm concerned. The mantra of sex sells is common knowledge, and Game of Thrones seemed to prove that it is just as true when it comes to high-budget fantasy TV shows. But here and through the rest of the show, sex is never explicitly depicted, only implied. The show is okay with partial female nudity, and combined with Lan in the next scene, we know that it's only actual genitals that the show is afraid of. A PG-13 sex scene wouldn't necessarily improve the show, but if done tastefully can still convey world and character information to an audience, and by that same virtue, the lack of any depiction can do the same. We get neither. There is nothing to be drawn from the scene except that Egwene and Rand seem to be in an intimate relationship, and that is, perhaps, more effectively stated in Episode 7. I don't believe it's entirely clear in Episode 1 the extent of their relationship, and if their intimate encounter was meant as an act of passion brought on by Egwene's ceremony, or just another day in the life of these two. And consider what was lost by this inclusion. Egwene has only had 5 lines before the kiss, and 2 of them are interrupted by Rand. And I can't help but think this show is being a bit meta, as Egwene literally attempts to talk to Rand and contextualize her behavior with meaningful character information, but the show just goes, "Nah girl, here's a strawberry." It's extra weird because we cut away from this scene only to cut back to the same set and have the conversation that we should have been having here. And it kinda just feels like the showrunners are terrified of letting scenes carry on more than 3 minutes at a time. There's a million ways that you could have written this encounter, and the majority of them would be better for the characters than this. Egwene has made up her mind about becoming a wisdom, and this doesn't serve to dissuade her at all. She doesn't decide to hide the choice or even choose the long-standing relationship with Rand. All this does is literally make the audience wait 1 more minute before getting any kind of answers and potentially harm Egwene's moral character as she uses Rand for one last romp before breaking up with him, actively taking advantage of his feelings for her and his understanding of their relationship. This is manipulative, and it's not cool, Egwene. Why not just have her reluctantly push away from the kiss, or avoid it altogether? Have her apologize to Rand, but let her finish telling him about Nynaeve's offer. This could tell us that she's strong and focused. She's willing to sacrifice for what she wants and fight back against the current when it means keeping her head above water. And it would be more than possible to tell us that she's still invested in Rand and cares deeply about him while having her reject his immediate offers. Doing this would also help set up their intimate reunion in Episode 7, and make it more meaningful to the audience as the show's 2 characters accepting each other and their interests coming into alignment. Flesh out these characters. Show that they're both hurt. You can let Rand ask Egwene to let him finish the dishes alone and her apologetically giving him the space he needs to think, while developing Rand as someone who can be overly determined to see what he sets his mind on completed. Don't just throw in an implied sex scene because you don't know how to develop your characters while simultaneously updating your audience as to the history of their relationship. And definitely don't do it because you don't want the audience to look at your terrible sets for too long. But they do the do, and we join Lan and Moiraine as they share a bath and get a decent scene that serves to show us just how close the two are. Lan picks up that Moiraine believes they've found the dragon, and we cut back to Rand and Egwene in a way that tells us that Moiraine believes that Egwene is the dragon, a belief that Moiraine seems fairly confident about all the way up until Episode 7. I'm just going to drop a bookmark here as we'll have to cover the whole who's the dragon thing at a later point once the show has established itself a bit more. In the end, I guess it was more important that we see our protagonist taking a bath rather than understanding the character drama that's been hinted at for the last 10 minutes of the episode. And, wait, I'm sorry, what? Why is Egwene sitting naked in front of a fireplace? You know, the one in the middle of the inn's common room during a village-wide festival. Does she not care about being seen? Even if the door is locked, the windows aren't covered. Is this that free use thing I was talking about before? She's obviously covering herself for modesty. If it was for warmth, she would have just put her clothes on. And she seems to have been up for some time. Is she not concerned about strangers? And Aes Sedai and her warder are upstairs right now. What if one of them came down? They seem to be feared, and you just had a conversation where your elders speculated that her presence meant that there could be some threat from the war. What if those soldiers from Tarn Ferry or a merchant were to come by and go to the well-lit, obvious inn? We see in the next shot that all the homes still have lights on and every light in the inn seems lit, so it's not unreasonably late for people to be out and about. The rain has also picked up again, so I guess Matt just got lucky earlier. Spoilers. Moving on, Rand enters from the inn's attachment where Egwene's room would supposedly be, since I guess they couldn't afford to redress one of the sets, and just absolutely had to reuse this one. He sits with Egwene and pushes her on what's bothering her. We finally learn that sometime in the last few days, Nynaeve asked Egwene to apprentice with her as a wisdom. This upsets Rand as it means the end to his relationship with Egwene, and at least to him suggests that he values it more than Egwene does. Whether or not she has already made up her mind, Rand goes to bed and Egwene half-heartedly calls out to him so she can finish her "it's not you, it's me" breakup speech. However, it turns out that Egwene does in fact already know how to listen to the wind, as an unsettling sound reaches her and we see the approach of a fade. Just a small thing, but the whistling motif being immediately associated with the spooky bad guy before transitioning to Pat and Fain being the source of that whistle is neat. Good job. After a good night's rest, Matt attempts to fence the stolen bracelet to Fain, and I'm again left wondering why Matt didn't just steal the money he needed. Fain gives Matt 3 lanterns, and the whole time they're waving the bracelet around rather carelessly, especially given that this is a small enough town that Matt should have a bit of a reputation if he's been consistently stealing things. If nothing else, Matt is destitute and from a broken family. The village would know this. People seeing him sell a very intricate and expensive-looking bracelet would necessarily raise eyebrows, even if they don't immediately recognize it. And that's to say nothing of the impressive lack of connection to the village that any of the 5 have. With his background and personality, surely Matt would have a few critics, such as a few younger guys who are jealous of his charisma and skill with the ladies. It is established that this is a regular exchange between the two. Fain even tells us that he comes to the village every Bel Tine to sell lanterns. So how does this work? It can't be understated just how small and insular a community this seems to be. Yet Matt steals from them consistently around the same time each year and no one notices or cares. If Matt is good enough to get away with it, surely someone would draw the connection to Pat and Fain instead. Every year something goes missing when the peddler shows up. Not suspicious at all. And it's precious things too. This doesn't seem like a village with a whole lot of surplus wealth for precious metals and jewels. Surely something like this bracelet is an heirloom with immense sentimental value. The majority of time we spend with the village is centered around a holiday about remembering and communing with lost loved ones, so it's clearly something they value. And why is Matt stealing for him anyways? This seems to be the only thing Matt's stolen this year, so it's not like he does it weeks or months in advance. It was very last minute. And we're meant to assume that the only reason he does it is because he loses the money needed to buy his sister's lanterns. What has he been stealing in past years and why? Is he always losing his gamble the day before Fain arrives? And always pickpockets someone the night before? You can't convince me that it's something he forgets to prepare for. It's centered around his entire motivation. Of course, none of this matters. It's only meant to show us that Matt has sticky fingers when it comes to shiny things, even though it's inconsistent with what we're shown about both his character and the world. Meanwhile, Moiraine seems to be walking around and inspecting a bunch of 20-something-year-old women, to suggest that she's whittling down the eligible pool. But what exactly is the selection process here? Is Moiraine attempting to feel the power in all these girls, and if she can't, she ignores them? Except we know she can't see the power in those who haven't already used it. Is she seeing if they're Ta'veren like Fain suggests in episode 8? This would imply it's not that easy, right? She asks Lan about if he's sure that one of the eyeless was lurking about last night and says that they both have work to do. I find it curious that Moiraine doesn't seem to know about the fate herself. The show establishes that the concept of listening to the wind is a form of channeling, and we see Egwene do so right before the fate arrives. Would Moiraine not have been able to hear it as well? It's not like you're actually listening to the wind, as Egwene does it in the middle of a stone building with all the doors and windows shut. Lan is silent during this scene, but Moiraine implies that Lan had been up all night, either looking for or watching the fade. In the books, warders are able to sense the presence of shadow spawn, but that isn't established as a warder ability anywhere in the show. Instead, we are given much more to suggest that it's actually channelers who can sense them. Also, Lan not actually talking to Moiraine is a bit weird here. Regardless of how he knows, the presence of a Fade is absolutely something he'd want to be actively discussing with Moiraine, even a lone one. It's extra strange given that he abandons the whole stoic silence thing halfway through episode 2. Regardless, we get our first look at the dubious nature of our protagonists as the show tells us that neither are moral agents. They make absolutely zero effort to warn or prepare the town, both against the Fade and when we learn the Fade isn't alone. Moiraine is shown to be spending most of the day just tucked away in her room. Could she not have set up wards to alert her of any approach? The Wisdom is the highest and only position of authority we know about in the show, and we see Moiraine talk to her, but doesn't warn Nynaeve at all. Even if there is no larger village council or authority of elders, they absolutely could and should have told someone. This is a fabrication of the show. It's the only way the writers could think to build tension and give Lan something to do, and it makes zero sense for Moiraine to keep this secret. She's not doing it to protect her mission. Everyone already knows that she's an Aes Sedai, and she openly and bluntly tells the entire village that she's looking for the Dragon Reborn, which is a revelation that has about as much impact on the characters as if they were siblings who just got told it was their turn to do the dishes. In the books, Moiraine is cryptic and suspicious because she is overly nice to everyone, but is actively and clearly hiding her intentions from the other characters. As readers, we begin to piece together her motivations, but we only do so from the information trickled to us from our point of view characters. And it works because Moiraine does everything she can to earn the trust of the four Emmons Fielders, particularly the boys, but knows that if she were to fully reveal her mission to them, it would shatter that trust. And it's true. It's not until the end of the third book that Rand actually accepts that he's the Dragon Reborn, and he spends almost the entirety of that time like a fantasy equivalent of a toddler who doesn't want to be dragged out of the toy aisle at Walmart. And for good reason. I know that the show's version of the Dragon Reborn is really lame and underwhelming, but imagine that you are a devout Christian, and a rabbi comes up and tells you you're the Antichrist after your family is attacked by ISIS, and forces you to follow them under threat of death. It's not a perfect analogy, but, the dragon is literally one of Satan's titles in Christianity, so naturally you'd understand why Book Moiraine thinks it's important enough to keep it a secret. Show Moiraine isn't concerned about any of this. She openly admits that she's after the dragon as soon as someone asks her about it, and she's warm smiles and niceties to everyone except the 5 people that she would absolutely want to have trust her. But okay, let's assume Moiraine wants to still hide her mission for some reason, and the writers can't think of a way to have her cleverly warn the village without revealing it. Have Lan be the one to tell the villagers while Moiraine scouts out the possible dragon. In the books, Lan would almost always lead and control conversations while the two traveled, precisely because he can't be backed into a corner to reveal information they don't want revealed. Even if the writers made the villagers ultimately not believe them or care for whatever reason, their choice to not do anything puts everyone's blood on their hands. But we've already gone 20 seconds without a cut, so we jump up the mountain to where Rand is contemplating about what Egwene told him the night before, and it looks like a pretty decent hike. Given that we were told earlier the wolves are being more active, it makes sense that Rand brought his bow up with him. But Egwene went all this way, seemingly unarmed and without guarantee that Rand would be up here anyways. Otherwise, this is another rare scene that is otherwise decent as we get closure on Egwene and Rand's conflict as Rand comforts her and we get an aerial shot showing us just how small this town actually is. After a minute and a half with the no longer lovebirds, we cut to Nynaeve as she cleans an underground spring, referred to as a sacred pool. Just as a real quick book note for later, Moiraine establishes to us that Nynaeve is the leader of the village. And with how small a community the Two Rivers is, and the lack of any reference to any other positions outside the women's circle, we can conclude that Nynaeve is actually the de facto leader of the Two Rivers. However, Nynaeve cuts to the chase and asks Moiraine what she's doing here. Moiraine takes it to mean in the sacred pool and responds that she wanted to walk. We'll talk about the oaths more specifically when I cover episode 2, but as a reminder, the first oath of an Aes Sedai is to speak no word that is not true. This actually tells us that Moiraine wasn't looking for Nynaeve when she came here. Moiraine is under the impression that she's on a time limit, and the implication is that she actually is just killing time exploring, and only happened to find Nynaeve here. It's a small thing, but it's an answer to a direct question that Moiraine addresses in reference to the pools. Moiraine is here because she wanted to take a walk. This isn't a simple misdirection to throw Nynaeve off Moraine's interest in her. It's a direct answer that implies intent and purpose. With what we see through this series, it actually does fit with Moiraine's character for her to be this monumentally stupid. But it is actually a soft contradiction, as Moiraine told us earlier that she had much to do. And in the same scene, we know that she's been sleuthing around the village asking questions about Nynaeve at least. The rest of this conversation also carries with it the idea that it was Moraine's intention to find Nynaeve here. So either Moiraine is careless, or she has broken an oath. But I probably shouldn't expect the writers of the show to understand that. Regardless, Nynaeve pushes again, and Moiraine actually does misdirect to control the conversation, telling us that Nynaeve was brought here as a baby after her parents passed. Just going to drop another bookmark here, as we'll cover this more when we get to episode 4. Instead, let's talk about why Moiraine is interested in Nynaeve at all. She seems to have actually put more effort into learning about Nynaeve than any of the other characters, including talking to multiple people about her. But Moiraine seems to have lost interest in her as soon as she learns that Nynaeve is actually 26 years old, implying that she's too old to be the dragon, but how could she have not learned that information any other way? Moiraine talks about the lack of records, but she also says that people think Nynaeve is too young to be a wisdom, so surely someone has an idea of how old she is. Even if no one knows her exact age, they'd have an idea. Moiraine knows enough about the braiding ceremony to know that it happens when a girl reaches the age of 20 to 21. Are we to believe that no one remembers Nynaeve's induction to the women's circle? How long has Nynaeve even been the wisdom? It's a village of about 100 people who interact with each other every day, and no one has any clue as to how old their leader is. There's enough dissent in the village for some people to question Nynaeve's age directly, but no one cares beyond that. This would probably be the biggest controversy in the village, but no one can even give Moiraine a ballpark estimate. Moiraine learns Nynaeve's age as soon as she figures out how long she's had the braid. Not a single other person she talked to could have told her that Nynaeve has had the braid for more than 2 years. Okay. This show has a real problem with the whole living world idea, and this is part of why. The Two Rivers is not a real place and does not exist in the world if the camera isn't actively on it. These people are not people, they are actors on a set, which sounds obtuse, but all fiction relies on the suspension of disbelief. Your entire job as a writer, director, and showrunner, especially on an epic fantasy TV show, is to make me believe that for the duration of the runtime what I am watching is real, that the characters are people and their problems matter, so that I am invested and immersed in how they solve or overcome the obstacles in their lives. You are failing, and we are barely at the halfway mark of the first episode. This should be the easiest part. And it does matter, because the age thing is literally the entire reason Moiraine is investigating Nynaeve. Remember that Moiraine, for some reason, cannot sense that Nynaeve can channel, so she's not interested in that. So Nynaeve must be ta'veren, right? Well, except that Moiraine says that there are only 4 ta'veren, and they're all the right age, which we know would be Egwene, Rand, Mat, and Perrin. Which just raises all the questions about ta'veren again. Can Moiraine tell? What does it mean to be ta'veren? Is it something inherent to the person and lifelong? Is it connected to magic? Or is it something bestowed as needed by the wheel like in the books? In episode 8, Padan Fain seems to confirm that Nynaeve is in fact a ta'veren, but was she always one, or did she become one when she unlocked her channeling? If not, why does Moiraine think that there's only 4? Who would have spread information about there being 4 ta'veren in the Two Rivers and not known about the 5th? Is it that she actually has heard about a 5th, or even 10 or 20 ta'veren in the Two Rivers? It's just whoever is spreading this information and sharing it with Aes Sedai happened to know specifically that only 4 of them were in their early 20s? Did Padan Fain know about it this whole time? Is he the one who's been spreading it? Why would he do that? If he knows, he would have a direct interest in keeping it secret. As we see, it's what attracted an Aes Sedai here in the first place. And Moiraine has to be able to see who's ta'veren, otherwise she'd have no interest in any of the boys in the first place. But if she can tell who's ta'veren, why is she so flagrantly dismissive of Nynaeve when she first arrives? What does Moiraine even mean when she says no one keeps records of births and deaths? Moraine's entire objective is Nynaeve's age, so I guess it makes sense she'd say births. But whose death would she be referring to? Nynaeve's parents would be the obvious target, but Nynaeve interprets it to be about the old wisdom. Moiraine also just stands in silence as she kinda just hopes that Nynaeve opens up. If Moraine's objective is to learn about Nynaeve's age, why does she let the conversation go off to the old wisdom? Moiraine just stands there and we get the impression that she's trying to size Nynaeve up. But why? You literally need one piece of information to determine whether or not you need to invest in her. And you've already made her hostile towards you, so it's not like buttering her up will help. Things only continue to get messy as Nynaeve tells the story of the old wisdom. Bookmark this for a pretty obvious conversation later. But the thing I want to point out now is that Nynaeve herself draws a direct connection between a wisdom's listening to the wind and channeling. Holy mother's milk in a cup. I hope I don't have to explain how terrible this is logistically, but I guess I will anyways. So Nynaeve knows that when she's listening to the wind, she's channeling. We see her channel in this episode. We know that the wisdom before her was able to channel, and actually taught Nynaeve how to do it. Nynaeve is also able to tell that Egwene can channel, and would be able to teach her, and we see Egwene do this as well, twice in this episode. But we are told later that Moiraine had no clue that Nynaeve could channel, and it's outright stated that Nynaeve had never touched the power before episode 4. So how is she listening to the wind? Why does Moiraine not react to this story at all? As we established before, Moiraine has to at least suspect that Nynaeve is ta'veren, and she all but just slapped you in the face and said that she can channel. Yet Moiraine doesn't even raise an eyebrow at it. If anything, Moraine's lack of a response tells us that the connection between the two is accurate. She spends the entire season drooling over how powerful a channeler Egwene is, but how does she know Egwene can channel if not her being able to listen to the wind? She doesn't test Egwene until the next episode, so it can't be anything else. And again, we know that Nynaeve definitely can listen to the wind. She even comments on her inability to in episode 8, not to mention how the entire drama between Rand and Egwene is centered around Nynaeve teaching Egwene how to channel. And Nynaeve knows this, but Moiraine doesn't care. Blood and bloody ashes. That entire story is mind-numbingly stupid, and that's not even touching on how large a deviation it is from the source material. But to top off this entire dumpster fire of a scene, Nynaeve openly threatens Moiraine and establishes a clear distrust, right before leaving Moiraine alone with the sacred pool. At this point, we've begun establishing a pattern as to why the show is terrified of letting any scene go longer than a minute. So to compensate, we get a scene with the boys that lasts for literally 31 seconds as we just learn that Rand isn't actually as okay with his breakup as he let on earlier. Time well spent. Egwene is presumably crying over ending things with Rand as she and Nynaeve listen to the wind and hear the sounds of Trollocs and Fades in the distance. It's unclear as to the extent of this ability, but both are confused and unnerved by it, but ultimately do nothing. I won't get into whether or not Moiraine should have been doing this as well. Again, it's clearly a channeling thing, but I don't know why the girls don't act on this at all. On its own, I could see them brushing it off as something unusual, but ultimately harmless. But it's clearly ominous and frightening for both of them. And at least Egwene knows that it started the same time that an Aes Sedai and her warder arrived in the village. Surely that would send out some alarm bells. After all, we just heard Nynaeve rightly talk about how she wouldn't hesitate to defend the village from Moiraine a minute ago? They believe that Moraine's presence has something to do with the war in Gildan, and I find it hard to believe that both of them wouldn't know about the soldiers in Tarn Ferry, so it could easily be the sounds of an approaching army. Trollocs or no. But I guess they both know that it has nothing to do with Moiraine or the war, so it's all cool. The tension continues to grow as Lan stalks through the woods and uncovers some kind of ritual site. 15 sheep have been brutally disemboweled and used to form an implied yin-yang, and I'm just left wondering, why? In universe, a version of yin-yang was used as the symbol of the Aes Sedai during the Age of Legends, as it represented the joining of the masculine and feminine sides of the one power. After the breaking and the division of the Aes Sedai, its two parts took on separate meanings. The white, female half is the Flame of Tar Valon, and is used as the modern-day symbol of the Order. The black, male half is now known as the Dragon's Fang, and is used as a bad omen because of its association with the corruption of male channelers. There is a whole history involved, but ultimately the Dragon's Fang is commonly used to represent a curse or accuse someone of being a dark friend, and is actually used by such to misdirect and cause disharmony. While not explicitly stated in the show, it seems to be that the basic elements of this symbolism remains. Why bring this up? Well, the show implies that this is the work of the Trollocs, and this is how Lan finds out about them. But why would the Trollocs do this? The Dragon's Fang has no actual connection to the Dark One, and is in fact the symbol of his enemies that's just been forgotten with the passage of time. Would Trollocs be smart and coordinated enough to do this as a mockery of the Aes Sedai who existed literally 3,000 years ago? Why would they care? The show also tells us that Trollocs are ravenous enough that they actively cannibalize each other at even the slightest smell of blood, even when there are plenty of alternative food sources. Would they really have done this and not just eaten the sheep? The sheep are mangled, yes, but it doesn't look like they've really been nibbled on. If it's a message, who is it for? Were they expecting Lan to stumble across this? If it's meant for themselves as some kind of pre-slaughter war ritual, again, why are they using the Dragon's Fang? Perhaps the Fade did it and that's why the sheep are untouched. But then why is it still in the middle of the woods? Why would any ritual of the Shadow Spawn involve this symbol over one of their own? Why aren't there any other signs of them? If it is important to them in any way, why aren't some of the Trollocs here? Whose sheep are missing? Do they not care? Would they not bring this up to the village wisdom? If it's far enough away from the village that the shepherd left for Bel Tine like Tam and Rand did, how did Lan find it? Did he just pick a direction and get lucky? I don't even want to think about the logistics of Pat and Fain doing this. I've touched on it a bit already, but why is Moiraine wasting time sitting in the inn? Unlike the rest of the village, she knows the danger that they're in right now. And the closer you get to nighttime, the more likely it would be that the Fade will strike. The show has shifted its perspective to put Moiraine as the story's protagonist. So why do we only see her seemingly talk to Nynaeve by accident? Why don't we watch as she asks around the village and learns about the boys and Egwene? She seems to know that they're Ta'veren, so why is she not talking to them, ingratiating them towards her, getting a feel for them? The rules of the magic system are a total disaster, but from her perspective she should be putting the most effort into determining whether or not one of the boys is the dragon. Especially if the show wants us to believe that Moiraine can't tell if the boys can channel or not. Watching them from the window isn't doing anything to help her mission. If not the boys themselves, why not a scene of Moiraine asking Tam about Rand, where we can see Tam grow increasingly mistrustful, and politely end the conversation before heading out and telling Rand that they need to go back home. Of course, you can't do that, because if you put any emphasis on Rand and Tam, the whole dragon mystery crumbles. And if you have Tam or Rand be nervous about something, you ruin this strange build-up to the attack on Bel Tine, where you have the entire village be blissfully unaware of any possible danger, even though you've put a lot of effort into trying to build tension. And with the exception of the 3 boys, our entire main cast knows something is wrong. So whatever. There is, however, a little shiny moment as Perrin and Rand present Matt with the money he needs to buy the lanterns. It's a simple exchange that is pulled off entirely by the acting. And while I personally disagree with some of Matt's new characterization, Barney Harris's performance in particular is consistently fantastic. And it's scenes like this that explain why people have gravitated so much to this version of the character. But that 30 seconds of gold can't stick around too long as Rand tells the boys he's headed home and Moiraine just watches him go. I'm not sure what Moiraine's expression is during this shot, but I imagine it's confusion and frustration as she realizes that she's just wasted all that time not doing anything as she watches someone with a 25% chance of being her entire purpose in the show walk away to their possible death. Remember, unlike in the source material, Moiraine already knows that a fade is in the two rivers, and she knows that fade is after the same thing she is. Her letting Rand leave is her knowingly leaving him out to dry. If Rand is the dragon, or if the Fade suspects he is, which is likely, leaving the village in close proximity to Moiraine makes him an incredibly easy target. She doesn't even know about the Trollocs yet, so the Fade could easily kill Rand without anyone else, including Moiraine, knowing for quite a long time. I guess if he dies, she would know that he wasn't the dragon, ? That's an awfully large risk to be taking with the fate of the world, and an incredibly stupid philosophy that Moiraine can't hold, otherwise she wouldn't be looking for him in the first place. With it basically confirmed that Rand is in fact the dragon, Moiraine really lucked out on this one. Or maybe it was someone else's luck. Rand and Tam make the journey back home and lose surprisingly little light while doing so, despite it supposedly being early spring. And Rand tells Tam that they should be back at Bel Tine to light a candle for his mother, literally as Tam is setting a candle and fastening a lantern right in front of him. Good on the show for making one of its main characters mentally challenged, though it does make me a little nervous how often he swings that bow around now. Are you serious, Rand? How dense do you have to be? He says this as though they aren't actually going to have a candle for her, as Tam is literally preparing to light one 2 feet in front of him. And why does he say it that way? That they should be at Bel Tine? Is the name of the village actually Bel Tine? After all, they don't call it Emond's Field the entire series, only the village of the two rivers. But that can't be, since Bran clearly refers to it as a holiday. There seems to be a clear religious element to this whole event, so is Bel Tine the holiday, or is it the actual festival happening in town? You wouldn't say, maybe we should be at Easter, to dye an egg for. And why the sudden remorse? You've potentially been walking for hours, and you didn't ask to turn back? Why did you even come back at all? Rand, you're like 26 years old. Is this not something you do every year? Is this the first time you've asked about it? I know that you only came back because that's what you did in the book, but you had good reasons then, and your being reluctant about it made sense. Tam seems to clearly give weight to the religious exercise, so I don't believe for a second that you'd spent previous Bel Tines doing the weird river thing. I'll be covering this topic a bit more as we progress, but it's also really strange to me that they attach a religious ceremony to the wheel, and all it does is muddle the waters as to what the wheel actually is or does. The wheel is a fact of reality that is well known and established in the scientific fields. It is not a god or religious symbol. It is simply the mechanism used to progress time and facilitate the unending pattern of reincarnation present in this world. To dress it up in meaningless ceremonies would be like watching someone worship gravity or physics in general. Not to say that you couldn't take this approach, but you have to remember that this is being presented to an audience. And as an audience, this is the most direct information we get about one of the setting's largest and most important elements of world building. There is nothing else. This is how the wheel works in this world. In the books, Bel Tine is simply a spring festival to signal the end of winter. Now, could it be used as a sort of remembrance ceremony? Sure, except that's not what's actually going on here. Tam specifically says that the point of the lantern is as communion with the Wheel of Time itself. That you're attempting to guide a spirit back to a specific location or family. So is that actually how it works? Or is this superstitious nonsense? You don't know how long it takes a spirit to be spun out again. But we do see that the dragon takes 3,000 years to be reborn. So is the idea that you light these lanterns in regards to specific people and spirits, and 3,000 years later they'll be reincarnated in roughly the same geographical area? Also, this is an annual religious festival, and it's the first time Rand has asked about it? It is your job as a writer to find effective and efficient solutions to giving your audience the information they need to understand your settings, characters, and plots. Having your characters clumsily have conversations they should have had 15 years ago is not a good answer to that problem, especially when all it does is actually muddle your world building. The Aes Sedai are perhaps the highest authority characters we see in the show, and they act like the wheel is a real thing, and the Dragon Reborn would suggest that it is. Tam even tells us that they believe in the wheel, despite them not having memory from their past lives. So they are aware of it as a part of the fabric of reality, and not as some vague tradition built up over generations of isolation based on even so much as a hint of déjà vu. So again, is this just superstition because country folk are too stupid to understand physics? Or is the ceremony truthful to the world building? With this lantern ceremony having real, tangible effects on how the wheel actually functions. We also get a montage of our other characters participating in this, with the implication that they've all lost people. But why the river? Tam is our narrator through this whole ceremony, and he told us explicitly that the point is, again, to guide their spirits back to you. And Moiraine confirms this isn't Tam just being an unreliable narrator when the festival actually begins. If the lanterns, and more specifically the candles, are the mechanism meant to do this, wouldn't sending them down a river away from you be the opposite of what you want? If you're going to craft original rites and rituals for a pre-existing fantasy work, can you at least have it be logically consistent? I know they did the river thing because it makes for a pretty shot and mirrors cultural traditions in the real world, but could you put effort into something in this show? I'm not a historical scholar, but to my understanding, Tam should also not be using friction matches in this scene. I understand that Wheel of Time isn't actually a medieval fantasy despite the show trying to depict it as such. But what I'm getting at is that matches as a technology were conceptualized in the late 17th century and weren't made widely available in this kind of format until the 19th century. This is an extremely specific kind of tool to survive the breaking, and I can't imagine it would be easy to produce with the technology level we see in the show. I mean, he even has a little strike box to go with it. Even allowing it, would it actually be so common and available as to have made it all the way to the two rivers? Whether or not they're the ones who actually fabricated them. Just a bit jarring to see when considering everything else in the show. But they do remember that Bel Tine is meant to be a joyous celebration, and so we transition from our slow and somber remembrance ceremony to the flamboyant and fun festivities by virtue of Moiraine signaling for the local band to begin playing, reinforcing that this is a town led by the women's circle. The dancing begins, and there's a couple sweet moments, such as Matt dancing with his sisters and Layla finally looking happy as she and Perrin join in. Everything seems to be going well as we are reminded that Lan is in the show. The show does establish that the water bond allows him to sense where Moiraine is, so it's fine that he found her along the river. But what has he been doing all day? After he left in the morning, we only saw him once, during the Trolloc Dragon Fang scene. And it was about midday. Well, it's pretty late into the night now, so where has he been? We don't see Lan find any Trolloc camps, so is it just the Fang that alerted him to their presence? If Lan suspected Trollocs after the Fang, why didn't he go straight back to warn Moiraine, instead of wasting half the day and putting the both of them in danger? If the Fang has nothing to do with the Trollocs, then why do we even see Lan find it? The scene is the only connection between Lan leaving Moiraine in the morning and returning now, so it feels like we're meant to assume he found the Fang and then tracked the camp after. But to do so just locks us in this loop of asking the same questions, which I guess is a staple of this show, to be fair. Episode 8 establishes that Lan doesn't even know how to track, so why does he leave at all? He doesn't know about the Trollocs in the morning, so he is obviously after the Fade. But we see Fade's shadow walk in the show. Are we really meant to assume that Lan knows how to track something that can literally disappear in thin air when he can't follow the footsteps of a woman he's been traveling 20 years with? Has he just been randomly exploring the forest, hoping that he stumbles on the bad guy's camp? And what was he gonna do when he found them? Remember, he already knows about the Fade, so was he attempting to track it down and kill it without Moiraine? Can he do that? I thought the entire point was that the Fade was too much for even Moiraine to handle, hence the ticking clock. But then we find her here, alone in the middle of the night, some distance away from the rest of the village, surrounded by trees that could easily give cover to a shadow-walking Fade. So maybe she isn't bothered by the Fade after all. This is terrible writing. You've opted to establish this episode's tension through a ticking clock that the characters are aware of, but when they don't respond to it appropriately, you undermine the stakes you're attempting to raise. Your villains become less threatening when they are dismissed so casually. The Fade has inadvertently been demoted as a dangerous foe to a position lower than Trollocs, by virtue of how you have our protagonists, who are wise and experienced in this world, react to them. This isn't a small-town young adult underestimating your villain. It's the characters with the highest level of authority we've been exposed to at this point, and who also happen to be our focal point for unraveling the story you're telling. Either the Fade is a threat or he isn't, but when you have the characters exposit that he is while behaving like he isn't, you harm every element of your story. At best, the characters come off as incompetent, at worst, malicious. The latter would be fine, except they are actively represented as the opposite throughout the rest of the story. The Fade is a joke, and that is a massive problem as he is clearly meant to be our direct antagonist for the first 2 episodes, with his threat lingering on until the party reaches Tar Valon. So why even bother with him? Why not just replace him with Padden Fain? It's not like you're trying to keep his status as a dark friend secret. Make Fain the antagonist over the course of the show, the consistent villain that has been pulling the strings this whole time, since that's clearly what you wanted to do with him anyways. Let the party know about him and his presence during Bel Tine. Let his presence and influence be felt by the group, so that when Perrin faces him in the end as the character who lost the most at Fain's hands, there will be an actual meaning behind it. The Fade is useless, and the characters acknowledge him as such. And honestly, I'm left confused as to why the writers would latch on to these superficial elements. They obviously aren't burdened by such concerns when it comes to nearly any other aspect of Robert Jordan's works, particularly when to include these elements actively interfere with the story they're trying to tell, to the point that the inclusion of such is made meaningless anyways by the writing. Here the Fade exists for the sole purpose of just being a callback to the Nazgul, nothing more. He's not able to interact or influence the world or story beyond just being spooky for the audience, while reminding us of better fantasy media in the hopes that we won't pay too much attention to what's actually happening on screen. The only sad thing is that it seems to have worked with the vast majority of this show's audience, but I digress. This entire setup suggests that Lan actually would be able to kill the Fade on his own, but with how important all of this is, wouldn't it be a lot better for Moiraine to have gone with him? Let's walk through some alternate scenarios real quick. Timeline 1. Lan and Moiraine think that there's only a Fade. They both go into the woods, and they're right. The Fade is alone. They kill it, and now they have all the time they need to find the dragon. Timeline 2. Lan and Moiraine think that there's only a Fade. They both stay in the village and just work diligently to identify the dragon and stay close to the final 4 candidates. They're right, and the Fade is alone. They set a trap and wait for the Fade to make a move and kill it when it does, leaving them all the time they need to find the dragon. Timeline 3. Lan and Moiraine think that there's only a Fade. They both go into the woods and they're wrong. The Fade has Trollocs with him. It's too much of a risk to fight on their own, so they return to the village and warn everyone about the danger. They are able to prepare some rudimentary defenses and are ready for when the Trollocs attack that night. They hold off the assault with minimal casualties and damage to the village while ensuring that their 4 candidates remain safe. The villagers are grateful to Moiraine for her protection, and she now has an easier time identifying the dragon. Timeline 4. Lan and Moiraine think that there's only a Fade. They both stay in the village and continue to identify the dragon, keeping a close eye on the final 4 candidates. They're wrong, and the Fade has Trollocs with him. They're caught off guard by the attack and scramble to help the villagers defend themselves while keeping the Ta'veren specifically safe. It's messy and there's an unfortunate amount of damage, but Moiraine can continue to identify the dragon. Timeline 5. Lan and Moiraine think that there's only a Fade. They both go into the woods and they're wrong. The Fade has Trollocs with him. They strategize and trap the Trollocs and wipe them out with the element of surprise. After all, Moiraine nearly single-handedly defeated the Trollocs anyways. She'd surely be able to do so with the tactical advantage, as well probably wouldn't even be injured this time, especially if she were to use the Sa'angreal, and they can both return to identify the dragon. This can keep going, but hopefully you see my point. Lan going out to do his work and kill the Fade without Moiraine can only end badly, especially after he finds the Fang and presumably suspects Trollocs. He tells Moiraine about them in this scene like they didn't expect it, so what was the plan? Why is he just gone from the episode? And he's our main male protagonist. With the emotional link between Aes Sedai and Warders, we have more to imply that Lan actually just got infected with Moraine's lazy attitude and decided to go for a walk over him doing anything remotely competent. Your desire to build tension is getting in the way of your characters and story, and every drop of blood spilt in the two rivers rests solely on your hands. Regardless, he warns Moiraine of the approaching danger and asks if she's been doing her part. It's at this point that Moiraine realizes she's in a badly written show and regrets all the time that she's wasted not doing her job in this episode. She just casually strode around the village earlier, she creeped on the boys from the comforts of her room, she got to do nothing as 25% of her mission walked away to their death, and she got to stand on the edge of the river and watch the pretty lights float by. I'm actually surprised she even managed to learn that Nynaeve wasn't a teenager. Must have been exhausting, that. Not nearly as exhausting as it must have been for the editors to keep turning all these single takes into a montage. I am not a dance expert, so feel free to discount this one, but I believe the point of these kinds of dances is that the circles spin around each other and you dance with a variety of people. And it looks like the circles do rotate, but everyone is actually dancing with the same people the entire time. Perrin and Layla remain paired together, and Egwene is dancing with Tom the entire time. We also don't see Nynaeve or Mat this whole time, though Danya is actually sitting off to the side alone. Wonder if she's noticed her missing bracelet yet. The dance is cut off early as Tom unfortunately becomes the target of a teleporting axe. Or at least I think he was the target. It's unclear as if the Trolloc was actually aiming for Egwene and Tom just got unlucky. We know the Dark One wants the dragon alive because of episode 8, which is presumably why the Trollocs don't kill Nynaeve. But this guy came really close to killing Egwene, especially when you consider there's all kinds of people just sitting and standing around that could have been much easier and safer targets. And what is with the pause after Tom goes down? Why do the Trollocs not charge in immediately? Why do they wait? If the Trollocs are coordinated enough to do a sneak attack and wait for confusion to set in on their prey, why does only one Trolloc throw his axe instead of several of them? How did no one see this guy approaching? There are people who aren't dancing actively looking in this direction. Oh, it's because he was hidden behind this drying rack or whatever. Then how did he make that throw? Why did he make that throw and go back into hiding? Just in case he missed? Is it canon that Trollocs are actually stealth ninjas, or can they shadow walk the way that Fades can? They seem like mindless brutes in every other scene that can't even contain their hunger for fresh meat. So is this guy just special? I know you wanted to have your spooky, oh no, moment with Egwene, but do you have to always go with your first idea? The villagers begin to scatter and we follow a frightened Egwene as more Trollocs arrive. We see a handful of men attempting to fight off the Trollocs, but fail. And things are looking hopeless before Nynaeve teleports in to grab Egwene and go to what may be one of the worst hiding spots she could have chosen to watch the slaughter. Perrin and Layla hurry back to the forge, and it's really lucky for them that the people already hiding there didn't think to lock the door themselves. Mat also makes it home where a whole group of people are hiding in the Cawthon house. But he realizes that he forgot to bring his sisters with him, so he yells at his parents and heads back out. Seriously, Mat, last we saw the girls were with you, and that was, 2 minutes ago? It's not like you left them to participate in the circle dance or hang out with Danya, so where did you leave them? He runs out and we get a sequence that only makes sense if you have book knowledge of Mat, and even then it's annoying. We watch as the Trollocs are lighting fires and causing random destruction, and still others are ravenously feasting on villagers both dead and alive, driving the idea that these are of course mindless brutes. Mat even stumbles over one as it's eating, and all it does is bark at him. Meanwhile, Nynaeve and Egwene attempt to help and comfort Senbui as he dies, and we get a shot of Tam and Rand's Bel Tine lantern to remind us that this is a holiday about remembering the dead, as the Trollocs just casually slaughter and destroy everyone with no rhyme or reason. With the cut to the lantern, we hear that Bella is distressed and startled by something as Rand and Tam prepare their dinner. Bella goes silent as the Trolloc kills her, and the two go to check when the door bursts open and the Trolloc charges in. Here we have an almost competent action scene as Rand and Tam fight off the Trolloc. Tam pulls out the heron-marked blade, and Rand ultimately kills the Trolloc with a fire poker after it has cut Tam. Pay attention to the strength of the Trolloc during this and the other scenes. Rand and Tam aren't small guys, yet the creature is able to throw them and tables all over the place while taking spears, arrows, and sword cuts. It can bust a hole in a wooden door and break off its iron locks with a single blow. So I do find it a little hard to believe that Tam is able to stand up against the Trolloc, putting its full weight into it, and only come away with as relatively small a cut as he did. Not the worst case of this, but figured I'd point it out. With Tam now poisoned, Rand begins to take Tam to the village where Nynaeve and Egwene are found by a Trolloc. Nynaeve covers Egwene before the Trolloc takes a swing at them. As you can imagine, with this being episode 1, there is a lot of topics that are relevant here, but would be better covered during a dissection of the later episodes. The bad guy's plan is one of those. So know that I'm not going to be diving fully into it just yet, but there are some things I need to say now that are relevant. So remember, as this Trolloc attempts to cleave both Egwene and Nynaeve in half, repeatedly, that the Dark One needs the dragon alive so that they can break the seal on his prison. Despite Fain's weird line in that episode, we can assume that the Dark One doesn't actually know who the dragon is because of how all of them continue to have the dreams. So why is this Trolloc attempting to kill them? The Fade spends this whole battle doing nothing. Surely his one job would be to make sure that the Trollocs don't kill the dragon candidates. Like, this guy has really gone off script, and the Fade should absolutely be stopping him. And speaking of Fain, why doesn't he play a more active role in this attack? He's not the pathetic Gollum-like character that he is in the books. Here he seems to actually be a rather high-ranking Dark Fiend with the ability to command Fades from the beginning. And he suggests in episode 8 that he'd spent years spying on the Two Rivers Five and knows all about them and would have helped coordinate this attack. Fain could easily have taken or killed Perrin in the finale, but suggests that the Dark One doesn't want any of them dead, or even captured yet, but that's for another time. So why isn't he, with or without the Fade, trying to catch the Five? He could be tracking them down and pretending to be helping them reach safety, only to actually lead them straight into traps set by the Fade while ensuring that these people that are seemingly so valuable to the Dark One, even after Rand declares himself the dragon, stay safe and alive. It's also strange as we cut to this right after a very clear display of just how strong these Trollocs actually are. Compare how casually Tam and Rand, who again are not small guys, get tossed like they're made of cardboard, while Nynaeve and Egwene are only pushed and stumble a little bit when they get hit. They should be flying. He shouldn't have an issue disarming Nynaeve and just grabbing the both of them with how easy it is in a few moments. Seriously, picks her up at a full sprint and doesn't miss a beat. There is no way they survive this as presented. This Trolloc clearly wants them dead, but they are saved by Moiraine as we get our first real display of channeling in the show. And there's already a problem. As previously mentioned, we'll discuss the Three Oaths more in part 2, but this is a very clear breaking of the Third Oath. Suffice it to say for now, in the writer's infinite wisdom, they made a clear and active decision to omit the caveat that allows Aes Sedai to openly use their magic as a weapon against Shadowspawn. Why did they do this? I don't know, but if you're going to make that change, you have to be consistent. Oh, who am I kidding? They're probably so dense they didn't even notice they messed it up. This is now a show problem. Every single time Moiraine uses her power against any of the Trollocs except the ones actively fighting Lan, or the one who throws the dagger at her, she is actively breaking her oaths. In before it's revealed that Moiraine has actually been Black Aja this whole time. Anyway, Moiraine breaks her oath and does a rather effective weave where she tears this Trolloc in half, and it doesn't seem to faze her at all. Making me wonder why she bothers with any other weave during this fight. Like, just keep using that one. The rest of the battle she never does it again, and the only reason is because they wanted us to see her do all kinds of different elemental spells, regardless of if it makes sense for Moiraine to actually be doing that. She spends the battle blinding Trollocs, lighting trees on fire, tossing them around, fireballing them, and throwing stones in displays that only impress me because I haven't gotten the Last Airbender movie out of my head yet. She even misses a couple of her fireballs, and a Trolloc actually tackles Lan to the ground. But she just keeps doing these massive displays and wasting all this power on only one or two Trollocs at a time. Every Trolloc she kills would have been just as easy, if not more so, to kill by just tearing them in half, with the only exception being the reinforcements that come in at the end. Those ones you could justify killing with the big directional attacks like the stones, fireballs, or lightning. After all, we see how effective that is later on. It's also worth noting that her and Lan made it all the way to the center of the village, presumably without killing a single Trolloc. Lan hasn't even unsheathed his sword until after Moiraine saves Egwene and Nynaeve. Like, think about how many Trollocs we see everywhere else in the town, even after Moiraine starts blasting them all. No way they made it here without issue. Speaking of which, I won't be doing a full throne room style breakdown on Lan's fighting, but suffice it to say it's rather wonky. There's a lot of really strange choices when it comes to choreography, and there's quite a few moments where a scene is shot from multiple angles, but they'll cut them together out of sequence so that Moiraine looks more active, but leaving Lan to fight the same Trollocs over and over, made especially obvious by the lack of bodies, despite Lan killing close to 20 Trollocs over the battle and all of them mere feet away from Moiraine. The edits are done to be purposefully confusing to make the action feel like it flows better, so the time and effort it would take to properly analyze is admittedly a bit beyond the scope of this video. So for now, we'll just do a few highlights, and who knows, if there's enough interest, maybe I'll eventually do a full frame-by-frame breakdown of it, either as a separate video or included in one of the later parts. Obvious things such as Trollocs like this one will just stand there and wait for Lan to hit them. The absolutely bizarre shot of Moiraine blinding 3 Trollocs as they teleport in, and Lan literally does the anime slash to kill all 3 of them. Or how these 2 are walking up on him, one with a sword, the other unarmed. Next shot, he's fighting 2 very different Trollocs, one which has a spear, and this one clearly just swings at nothing. And next shot, the original 2 are still approaching him. There's also something to be said about how jarring the transition between the Trollocs' costumes and CGI is. The costumes are very bulky and the movement is very basic and stiff, in contrast when they are CGI and they become lean and swift. I don't believe that the 2 versions are mixed very well together, and when you consider that a sizable amount of the budget was probably spent on just the Trollocs, it's unfortunate. It's not a popular opinion even among the show's detractors, but I'm actually not a big fan of the design they went with for the Trollocs, both in relation to their book counterparts and the role that they are meant to serve in the story. Perhaps I'll be adding that as another potential video topic in the future, but for now the important thing is the threat that these creatures are meant to represent is so incredibly inconsistent that it makes them really difficult to take seriously. I find it damaging to my investment to watch Lan kill so many so easily, with many literally only requiring a single cut, only to jump over to any of our other characters as they are absolutely laying into theirs with no effect. Lan's background can of course be used to justify a lot, but the strength, durability, and overall threat of the Trollocs is determined by what the writers need at any individual moment, which makes it difficult to care about. It's not actually our character's skill or abilities that will save them from an encounter, it's an arbitrary decision decided on high. The one time that Lan is actually threatened by a Trolloc is the one that managed to tackle him, but there's no context. We just cut back to him and one managed to teleport on top of him, but then he just kills it anyways and gets up without issue. A shot done entirely so we can pretend that Lan is struggling during this fight, with nothing to tell us how he got there. Did this one just get lucky? How did it manage to surprise him like that? How does he get so close and last so long without Moiraine doing anything? Lan has been fending off a consistent flow of them, but the one time he's overwhelmed and out of commission for even a few seconds, not a single one has managed to get to Moiraine, despite them getting scarily close every other shot. Never mind how these things are so strong that if one actually managed to pin Lan down like this, he'd absolutely be dead. The weight alone would be crushing. He's really lucky that all the Trolloc wanted was a quick tickle fight and not to eat him alive like we see them do to other people. Perrin is quite possibly the largest person we see in the 2 rivers, and is even as big as a couple of the Trollocs. The show tells us that he helps out Layla at the forge, so he actually is strong along with being big. Layla is a full-on blacksmith, and accurate or not, there's a connotation to that with strength. Yet the 2 of them couldn't overpower a single Trolloc with a battle axe and a smith's hammer, despite clearly getting hits in. And Tam may be older and out of practice, but the Dark One tells us that there is still something special about the heron-marked blade. Whether or not that association is still the Blade Master's mark, we know that Tam was a soldier of some sort, and we have no reason to assume that he didn't earn the heron mark. Yet despite his background while fighting a Trolloc 2-on-1, landing hits with spears, arrows, and getting 3 cuts in with a sword, Tam and Rand are only barely able to beat it. Going purely by what's presented in the show, we can even infer that Tam actually has fought Trollocs before. He's able to identify them almost immediately, while Rand doesn't. So it doesn't seem like they are recognizable to the general population in this world. Even people in Faldara, literally like a mile or 2 away from the edge of the Blight, don't seem to be able to identify a Trolloc, or even Fades for that matter. The inconsistency is an annoying oversight and cheapens the little tension you might have been able to build in these scenes. Are they overpowering damage sponges or not? Make up your mind, show. Especially when we get our hoorah moment as the village rallies and begins fighting back. And of course, it's only our strong, independent ensemble that is actually able to take down one with knives and pitchforks. I don't care if they outnumber it, the idea that they can so easily take even one down is beyond silly. Other than Perrin, we don't see any male villagers actually beat a Trolloc in groups or not. The scene with Daze Conger is just a girl power scene. And when you consider again how large and strong these creatures are, and even how much effort it took for Rand and Tam, who was a Blade Master, to beat a single one, or even Perrin and Layla, it all just seems a bit farcical. But you can make of this choice what you will. Rewind a bit as a Trolloc bursts into the forge and Perrin distracts it as Layla gets all of the villagers out. He tells her to leave as well, but we get the feeling that she does care about him as she stays and helps fight. Perrin grabs an axe that is clearly not meant for chopping wood, despite it being implied that is its purpose, and is knocked down by the Trolloc, prompting Layla to go hammer time on the beast. The two struggle with the Trolloc and it seems to be an even match. Having raced through the city unharmed, Matt finds his sisters hiding under a chicken coop, which looks to have protected them so far, and Matt tells us that they're going to run out and hide into the woods. Why this works, I have no idea. Supposedly, and Moiraine confirms this, the Trollocs are after them, and both the Fade and Fain are continuing to do nothing. Surely running out into the woods would make you an easier target, but fine. We cut back to Perrin and Layla as a second Trolloc wanders in before they've dealt with the first. How? Its back is to you and we know that the axe is effective against them, but I guess we can't let the first one die yet as we need it for our shock surprise later. Perrin and Layla are now each paired with their own Trolloc, and Layla is... Oh wow, so she's dead, right, show? Like, she's either getting crushed, impaled, or eaten right now, right? Like, look at this guy's face. He's not tearing into her with his tusks right now? No? She's fine? What was the point then? What was the Trolloc's plan here? Like, he already had her cornered against the wall. Okay, well, checking in on Egwene and Nynaeve, we see them continuing to try and care for the injured as a wild Trolloc appears and uses grab on Nynaeve. It's super effective. It's unclear as if he intended to grab Nynaeve or not, saving that for episode 3, but it proves that they can do just that. And Nynaeve is dragged off into the fog, kicking and screaming, leaving Egwene to fend for herself as a second Trolloc sees her and begins his chase. What happens to this Trolloc, I have no idea. Presumably Egwene is able to avoid it somehow. But no time for that, as we have our extremely well-developed, fleshed out, and totally earned emotional moment coming up for Perrin as we cut back to the forge in time to see Layla utterly wreck her Trolloc, and Perrin takes down his with 2 swings. Guess this one wasn't as strong as the first. Perrin goes berserker as he lays into this Trolloc in a frenzy before swinging wide and hitting Layla. And again, the logistics are broken. Layla knocked Trolloc 1 to the ground, but he grabbed her leg and pulled her down with him. Allowing for us being drawn into Perrin's tunnel vision, what was she about to do exactly? Trolloc 2 is laying fully in front of Perrin with Layla and Trolloc 1 behind him. He spins 180 degrees to kill her, so we know that hasn't changed. So why did she have her hammer primed to strike? Literally the only thing she could possibly have been aiming for is him. So was she actually about to kill Perrin as an answer to her marital woes? Maybe she got bloodthirsty as well and thought he was a Trolloc too. Oh well, history is written by the victors, and I guess Perrin was a faster draw. Though I don't want to fully discredit Marcus Rutherford's acting here, my issue is with the blocking and editing, not the individual performances. Tuning back into Egwene, who has lost her Trolloc and made it back to where Nynaeve had disappeared, she's picked up by her mother, who I can only assume has been trying to find her as opposed to hiding in the inn. And Egwene doesn't show any surprise or concern for Moiraine as she calls for Nynaeve, and her mother guiding her off to who knows where. A single knife is launched towards Moiraine and hits her dead on. Like, wow, what a great shot from a Trolloc. Never mind the fact that Moiraine probably has a punctured lung and possibly more than one broken rib now, combined with the poison from the blade, is absolutely dead as far as I can tell, with how long it takes her to get healed, but I'm not a doctor. So far in the show, Trollocs are at a 100% accuracy rate when it comes to their ranged attacks. Hope the show remains consistent on that. Lan tells her that there's too many and seems to imply a retreat, but Moiraine stares him into submission for being such a coward and continues to fight. Having already started as many fires, if not more than the Trollocs, Moiraine says, "Why not?" and proceeds to pull an entire building down to throw at the advancing reinforcements. Was this necessary? Probably not, but the showrunner seems to have a thing for unnecessarily destroying all the most recognizable things from the book, so I guess it checks out. Would it be a violation of the Third Oath to use the power to inadvertently kill a bunch of innocent non-shadow spawn? I mean, surely there's people inside the inn, right? And they're just dead now. This is a massive stone building in the middle of town next to where a mass of people were during the festival. A location with lots of food and tables and benches with which you can make barricades and actually hold some level of resistance. There were surely people inside eating and drinking as well during the dance. The lights are all on and the doors and windows look entirely intact, like the Trollocs have completely ignored the inn, but not a single person went in. Did they all just get the memo that Moiraine had scheduled it for demolition? There's actually a funny shot right before this of what looks like a little CGI guy in the back who runs past the inn, stops to check it out, and just does a slippery Looney Tunes run in place thing, as he decides it's probably best not to go in. It's really lucky for Moiraine that none of the 5 ta'veren are hiding in there. I mean, Egwene lives there. Surely it would be high on her list of places to go, or her mother's. It would also be a good place for Nynaeve and Egwene to have started setting up an infirmary. Big place, lots of people. We learned in the first half of this episode that Perrin prefers to be at the inn over the forge, so he could be there. And it would be far from unreasonable for Mat to have gone there as well. She's lost track of everyone because of her own stupidity, and they could literally all be in the building that she's pulling down. Which begs the question, why is she bothering to protect the village at all? Why does she choose to stand her ground in the middle of the town, as opposed to this being a sequence of her and Lan tactically finding and extracting each of the ta'veren? She cares enough about the town to defend it at the risk of both her and Lan's lives, but she doesn't care enough to have warned them or secretly set up even so much as a ward, let alone any kind of traps. The first thing she does is find Nynaeve and Egwene, but then she lets them get out of her sight so she can hold this position. Which holding this position only really makes sense if she's trying to protect something like, say, a large stone safe house full of people, including those she has a specific interest in. But Moiraine, not wanting to be outdone by the Trollocs, pulls down the inn and chucks a few pieces of it at the charging Trollocs before succumbing to her injury and passing out as a CGI dust cloud washes over her and Lan. As it happened, those were the last of the Trollocs and the battle is now over. And none of that is to mention the active threat that the Fade still poses, who presumably is still just standing on his little cliff watching everything. The Fade alone was enough to scare Moiraine and Lan earlier, yet despite watching his force be decimated, he does nothing. Perhaps he knows that the rest of the army is on its way and is willing to just bide his time, except that he would now see Moiraine wounded and Lan distracted. As soon as she took that hit, the Fade should absolutely see this as the perfect opportunity to strike. She is literally the only thing that can prevent you from getting the dragon. Killing her and Lan at any point after either the dagger or the inn's collapse should be easy for how dangerous these things are implied to be. Well, maybe the Fade actually left and he's the one bringing that larger army. First, this would imply that there actually is only one Fade commanding all of these Trollocs. Second, if he has access to that entire force, why would he have held it in reserve? We have to think that the Fae knows about Moiraine and Lan, else he would have attacked the first night. So it would have wanted to send in a crushing force from the beginning to overwhelm them with waves. Why not just keep an eye on the town and wait? The army will have arrived by the early morning before all the partying villagers wake up. It would be easy pickings. And it's not like shadow walking was a crucial element of your plans, so it's not like you have to attack at night. Rand arrives in the village with Tam on the back of a horse. Where he got this one from, who knows? Bella clearly died, so he must have had two, I guess. Lucky. I will talk about it more when we get to episode 7, but it's important to note here that the flashback there doesn't line up with this at all. Neither scene suggests that Rand had to face more than one Trolloc, and here Rand is very casually coming into town with no show of any additional hardships. In the flashback, he seems to have been carrying Tam through the woods, so where did the horse come from? There is no evidence in the show to suggest he had been hunted by the Trollocs in the Fade like in the book, so did he just carry Tam out into the woods only to bring him back, saddle up the horse, and prepare for the journey? Seems like someone forgot which continuity they were supposed to be in. Which just causes more problems, as the Fade would have just as much reason to go after Rand in the show as in the book. As it stands, it's just as likely that what Rand faced was a random Trolloc who got separated from the main band. That makes more sense than the Fade only sending one Trolloc to apprehend or more likely kill them. It was a poisoned blade after all. Rand then enters the village where we get a good look at all the destruction that Moiraine caused. And there's actually a kind of funny moment here where Egwene is tending to an older lady, and the expression that she makes when Egwene leaves her amuses me. Like she just can't believe that Egwene is about to forget all about her. They pull Tam over to where she and Moiraine had been treating a few people, and Egwene fetches Moiraine to heal Tam. When she arrives, she comments on him having been poisoned. Now, the way she says this makes it sound like it's not the standard thing for Trollocs who have poisoned their blades. Like she's been seeing to others who had been directly wounded by Trollocs, but Tam's was a particularly nasty wound just by virtue of the poison. If so, was Moiraine's wound not poisoned? That would help explain how she's able to keep going for so long even though Tam, who is a trained combat veteran, succumbed almost instantly to it. Of course, Tam is instantly and fully healed. It doesn't even seem to leave a scar. So Moiraine instantly gets up to leave, and just why? Is she on her way to heal someone else? The attack would have been over for at least a few hours now, no? So surely everyone in critical condition has already been seen to. Even then, why would she care? She has shown zero consideration to the villagers before the attack, and her 4 targets are all right in front of her. Why would she not be taking this moment to explain things to them? Why wait for Rand to confront her? Is it just her feeling guilty? Why does Rand confront her now at all? This lends itself to what I said earlier about Rand having a nice gentle walk down the mountain. His father, who moments ago was on the brink of death after protecting him from a monstrous creature he'd never seen before, who, if Rand were a normal person, would have spent the entire walk back to town worrying about, has just been healed in front of him and has regained full consciousness. But Rand doesn't say a single word to him. There's no thank the lights or I thought I lost you. He doesn't hug his father or even ask how he's feeling. Even if he addresses Moiraine first, it should be to tell her thank you in at least some form or fashion. Tam is absolutely the most important person in his life at this point. The show has portrayed their relationship as nothing but healthy and strong, yet he has shown more affection and care for the girl who dumped him the day before than his own father. And all of this is made worse when you consider the flashback. Rand should be reeling right now from what Tam said. He should be single-mindedly focused on reaffirming his relationship with the man who raised him, instead of standing up to Moiraine because reasons. I've heard Rand's portrayal likened to Anakin Skywalker in the Star Wars prequels, and it's scenes like this that illustrate why. Rand isn't a character. He doesn't react to the world around him in any reasonable way. He's not affected by events the way a normal person would be, and his characterization is inconsistent at best. Throughout the show, he will go 0 to 100 at random times and for reasons that are important to the writers, not the character. When his girlfriend of potentially many years was upset at something and avoiding him, how did he handle it? He didn't try to confront her and figure out the problem. Instead, he chose to just stay in a small room for hours on end and stare at her. How did he deal with it when that same girlfriend of potentially many years broke up with him to pursue a career? He thinks it over and decides to purposefully hide his feelings while supporting her. When his father is on the brink of death and reveals something world-shattering to him, he just walks it off. When his father is magically healed from a deadly poison right in front of him, instantly gets up to yell at the lady who did it. And when she tells him that no, actually he's the problem, he instantly calms down and believes her. Do you see my point? The one time that Rand absolutely should not be expressing any kind of anger or frustration is when he has a full outburst. And as if it could get worse, the character that it should be directed towards would actually be Egwene, if anything. If this is the result of Rand having bottled his emotions and events pushing him over the edge, why is he yelling at Moiraine instead of the woman who broke his heart and started the spiral of his emotional state? And who we know is the entire focal point of his character choices throughout the entirety of this season. Surely it would be her that he'd lash out against over anyone. This is the same character who just a day ago was warning Perrin about how dangerous it could be to question an Aes Sedai. Remember, Rand and Moiraine haven't said a single word to each other until now. There's been no interactions, no chemistry, no history to build off of that would warrant this reaction to her healing his only remaining family member. It's not even like Rand is mistrustful of the magic itself like he is in the books. It's jarring, and hopefully I've made my point clear. Egwene also stands up and follows him, but it's like she's backing him up. Moiraine saved her life, and it's hard to tell if she would know that Moiraine was the one who destroyed her home. But she seems to be fully accepting of her and thankful for her aid until Rand decides to challenge Moiraine. Then she's on board with it when she should be attempting to stop or calm Rand, or ignoring this altogether to continue caring for the injured. She is the closest thing the village has to a wisdom now after all. Perrin just randomly decided to wander over here as well, which I guess is fine, but combined with Mat following him so that all four end up in front of Moiraine for this conversation, it's a bit convenient when Perrin could easily be so wrapped up in his own turmoil that he just wanders off to be alone, with Mat either following to console his friend or returning to his own family. Moiraine proceeds to completely open up, proving that she's not intent on keeping secrets from the gang, and gives a brief SparkNote summary of the prequel book, New Spring. She confirms that the Shadow Spawn are indeed after them, and that the reason is because one of them is the dragon. That was quick. It will also be interesting to see what she meant by, his whispers are already in the back of our minds. And I'm excited to see where they go with that. Anyways, as I touched on earlier, the gang's reaction to being told that they're the dragon has as much impact on them as a stranger coming up and telling you that you probably pooped your pants. Mat responds appropriately to this, and Lan interrupts the conversation to point out the approach of a Trolloc army. The Trollocs also seem to be using torches now. You'd think that they wouldn't need them considering they're beastmen, but I guess as long as they're consistent about them not seeing in the dark, that's fine. Moiraine tells them that they need to leave, and we're faced with a rather large problem. And this is an important one as it feeds directly into our inciting incident and is the catalyst of the entire show. Why do any of them believe her? This entire conversation Rand has looked stone-faced, and Mat dismisses her outright. It is far more likely from the perspective of the four that it is actually just Moiraine that the Trollocs are after. This entire argument started because Rand insinuated as much or worse. Does it really only take Moiraine saying, "No you," for all four just to go,
"Yep, that makes sense to me. Let's go"?
Where is the evidence? You've spent the last hour showing us all the reasons why these characters wouldn't want to leave, and yet they will at the slightest nudge. Again, these aren't people, they're not even characters, they're caricatures. You've randomly given us Rand as the most skeptical of Moiraine, and as I covered earlier, he should be so concerned with Tam that he should actually be the one pushing back the most. A good amount of what we learn about Rand in this episode is that his primary aspiration is to lead a quiet family life here in the Two Rivers. His conflict with Egwene that will carry into the next episode is about her not wanting to share that dream. What reason does he have to abandon it as well? Egwene's desire to be a wisdom isn't connected at all to her wanderlust like it is in the book. She chooses that path out of a seemingly genuine desire to actually just be a wisdom, or worse, to be something special and set apart from other women. Nynaeve is believed to be dead, and Egwene would seem to be the closest thing that the two rivers have to replace her. Shouldn't she see it as her responsibility to remain and take on that role? Especially when you consider how desperately people are in need of care and the state that her own family is in at this very moment. For her to abandon them so easily is a damning indictment of her character. Mat holds his sisters above everything else. He literally resorts to stealing and gambling just to make them happy. His family is implied to be destitute and broken. His father is a womanizer and his mother is a drunk, forcing him to consistently step up and be the man of the house, to provide and care for the two innocent girls that he values more than his own life, in a struggle to keep them from sharing in the childhood trauma that the show implies he had. We see his pathetic excuses for parents abandoning his sisters twice in the span of 2 nights. And to Mat's mind, if he hadn't been there, his parents would have let his sisters die in the Trolloc attack. To think that he'd abandoned them because a strange woman that he hasn't said a word to before now told him to is insane. Perrin is the only one who might make sense, as he could view it as a way to put distance between him and Layla, both literally and figuratively, to get away in an attempt to put the last night as far behind him as possible. But would he do so before even seeing that Layla gets a proper burial ceremony? I know that Perrin is actually just a dick who married a girl out of spite, but he did seem pretty beat up about killing her, enough that he spent hours cleaning her as best he could before even coming out. In the book, the Trollocs actually led more of a surgical strike on the two rivers rather than a full-on raid. They had a couple distractions here and there, but their assault was focused on the homes of the 3 boys. The Cawthon's home, the forge that Perrin worked at, and Rand's farm. And it was there that the majority of the forces caused the greatest amount of destruction in trying to reach the boys, even going so far as completely skipping homes and buildings that were further away from the town center. It's the revelation of this information along with a couple other key encounters absent from the show that convinced the boys that Moiraine is right. But not only is this missing from the show, you can't even infer it, and nothing is offered in its place. The Trollocs were uncoordinated and unfocused. Their destruction and killing was random, and their homes simply weren't targeted. The fact that Rand only dealt with one Trolloc would actually be better evidence that he's not one of the targets than the inverse. Perrin's forge was only attacked by one Trolloc as well, quite a while after the battle had actually started. It was even a bit longer before a second Trolloc seemed to be walking by and noticed that there was a struggle going on. And the other 2 homes were completely intact. Egwene lives at the inn, and we can see clearly that before Moiraine pulls it down that it is completely untouched. Not even so much as a window was broken in an attempt to get inside or light the building on fire. The Cawthon house was also completely safe. We see a sizable amount of the town hiding in the shack, and Mat's parents are completely fine afterwards. And Abel Cawthon isn't the same man that he is in the books, so we can assume that if it had been attacked, they'd all be dead. Which, if Mat's home, being stuffed to the brink with people, isn't enough of a target for the Trollocs, then I don't know what would be. It makes no sense, and there is no reason why the 4 would or should believe her. Worse, there's no reason why the audience should believe Moiraine. She's put in no work to justify these conclusions, and I'm at the point where I'm questioning why Moiraine would even believe this. Egwene is the only one of the characters who had any level of interaction with the Shadow Spawn before the attack, and that was completely dropped and went nowhere. The Trolloc attack was so random and wild that none of our protagonists were really in direct danger until after the Trollocs had already begun feasting on the countless dead. Moiraine is only assuming that the 4 were the targets of the attack. Her only piece of evidence is literally her own mission. An army has materialized out of nowhere and marches on the remains of one of the Trollocs' greatest enemies, Manetheren. Moiraine and Lan aren't aware of them using the ways, so to their mind, the Dark One has put all this effort into sneaking an entire army this far south to do what? Only kill 4 very specific people and no one else? Moiraine speaks very authoritatively about them having no interest in the rest of the village when it could literally be a coincidence that the Trollocs are there to begin with. The show told us early on twice that it's possible to head south from the 2 rivers to reach Gildon, a kingdom in the midst of war. And Moiraine should absolutely know the cause of that war, Logain, a man who can channel and has proclaimed himself to be the dragon. with kings and lords pledging themselves to him as his power base continually grows and he becomes a threat to the White Tower itself. Ask yourself, what makes more sense? That the Fades have assembled an army because they mean to take it to Gildan and challenge a man that the world is already recognizing as the Dragon Reborn? That an army of Trollocs would be necessary to even get close to one who commands his own legions in an attempt to kill or capture Loghain? But, as the saying goes, an army marches on its stomach, and it goes double for the ravenous appetites of the Trollocs. So a Fade leads a small contingent of a few dozen to a small isolated village in the nearby woods and raid it for food and resources in the form of both livestock and people. But when an Aes Sedai presents herself and beats back this raiding party, the Fade returns and diverts the main army to crush this pathetic village and kill the ones who would dare defy the will of the Dark One, making it likely that the Fade is chasing after Moiraine to make her pay for all the warriors' lives she claimed during the battle. Or that those same Fades have led a host of hundreds of Trollocs this far south for the simple purpose of killing 4 20-year-olds. The Trollocs had no interest in taking them alive, and adding more Trollocs to the mix would naturally suggest an even lower survival rate for the dragon. So if the point is to kill them, surely a few Fades or some crafty dark friends would be more effective. And after they're dead, then what? You have an army in the middle of enemy territory. Do you honestly just bring them back to the Blight? I cannot stress enough how utterly clear the show is that the Trollocs were going to kill them. The one that was sent to kill Rand was even using a poisoned blade. It is literally only dark friends like Fain and Dana who express any level of interest in keeping them alive. Fain and his 2 Fades alone could have been enough to capture the 4 if that was the goal. What could these backwater lummoxes do to stop something that scares a warder and an Aes Sedai, let alone 2 of them? But the show cannot even fathom the idea of context, consistency, or comprehension. We are here to watch as the writers fling plot points at the screen and check them off one by one with no care or regard for whether or not the connective tissue is sound. That tissue is your story. The character is the underlying muscle that shifts and carries it. And when the skeleton of your plot is this brainless and haphazardly thrown together, all you'll have at the end is screaming mounds of wriggling flesh. But of course, they do believe her. Along with literally every single other person in the town. No one cares. There's an air of bittersweet understanding as our protagonists all saddle up and leave the town. You did not earn this, and I find myself struggling to even articulate how strange a choice this is. Every single thing I mentioned in regards to the 4 not believing Moiraine's nonsense is equally true, if not more so, for their parents. And everyone just gathers around to watch them leave like it's some big event. It even borders on depressing as it comes off like everyone just accepting their fate. That they know logistically they're all boned and have resigned to the fact that without Moiraine and Lan they maybe have 5 more minutes maximum to live. No one is continuing to work on clearing the damage or helping the injured. They're not grabbing the precious little they can to follow after Moiraine and find refuge in a nearby town. After all, we were told earlier this episode that Tarn Ferry had soldiers and mercenaries. I wonder if that could be useful. I've said it a lot now, but they made an active and deliberate choice to stage the scenario this way so that we would know that every single person here, Tam, the Alviers, the Cothans with Matt's little sisters, are all 100% undeniably dead. There are more than 300 Trollocs coming down this very visible trail that absolutely is going to go past the town. They will be all but going through the town, and they even put in the effort to CGI in the town complete with billowing smoke, signaling the Trollocs that there is indeed a town over there. Even if the road only goes next to the village and not through it, look at all the people here. 300 Trollocs, and if even 10 decide to stop and grab a snack, the villagers are beyond screwed. And it will be a lot more than 10. Moiraine explicitly tells them that wherever the Trollocs go, they will leave nothing and no one standing. But we are somehow meant to believe that this isn't one of the darkest television pilots of the last few years, as Moiraine gives a super upbeat and hopeful voiceover. If that isn't enough for you, just ask yourself, how are the Trollocs even going to know that the gang has already skipped town? There's pretty heavy tree cover, so it's not like they'd have really been able to see them from up on the mountain. If Trollocs would even be smart enough to be watching and not just in a mad sprint to get to the town as soon as possible. Would the Fade from the attack not harbor any ill will for the village that beat back his raiding party? If they're so desperate to capture or kill the dragon that they brought literal hundreds of Trollocs with them, are they not going to care at all about making sure they're not hiding somewhere in town? Even if they managed to pick up a scent trail, some of them would naturally follow it into the town square where most of our cast had just been standing around for a few hours. Or that the Fade would just leave anywhere from 50 to 100 Trollocs to clean things up while the main force continued to chase them. This is probably the largest military force that we see in the entire show. It's ridiculous to believe anything optimistic about the village's outcome. And it's the perfect summary of just how little care and effort went into this multi-million-dollar production as we close out the episode with what may be one of the scariest lines I've ever heard in a TV show.
But it was a beginning.
Ugh. Honestly, it still sends shivers down my spine. But I imagine if you've made it this far, you're probably already in the choir. And there we go. Roll credits on episode 1 of The Wheel of Prime. It has been my basic premise that the writing and script for this show has been fundamentally broken, but remember, this is indeed only the beginning. There's 7 more of these treasures left for us to dissect, and episode 1 is not only the shortest episode of the series, but actually one of the stronger ones, which genuinely makes me concerned for my own mental state going forward. Perhaps I'll succumb to the madness as well before we're through. Anyways, I hope you have found this video to be at least somewhat informative and equally entertaining. This has been a massive undertaking for me and the first project like this that I've ever done. And boy did it take longer than expected. I started working on this a little after episode 5 aired, and it took about a month of working in my free time to finish the script alone, not to mention the editing and recording. Thank you all for sticking around as long as you have. It means a lot to me, and I hope I have scratched any itch you may have had for an in-depth critique of the show. And know that unlike some, I openly welcome any criticism or feedback you may have. Lay it on me. This is my debut video, but I look forward to improving as I finish off the show and hopefully move on to maybe cover some other media. As I said in the intro, I'm not sure when I will have the next part of this series up, but feel free to subscribe and do the bell thing so that you can get notified when it gets uploaded. It was a bit of a crunch to get this first part out, and I actually did catch the coof while working on it, and lost my voice for a bit that made recording a bit difficult. But with that out of the way, it should be a much easier time working on the next few parts. Otherwise, I do stream on Twitch every so often, link in the description as well, though it is still just count ReVamp, so I shouldn't be too difficult to find if you want to pop in and have a chat. Just know that I don't have a consistent streaming schedule yet, due to work and family obligations. So it is a bit buyer beware on that one, I suppose. I also just want to give a quick shout out to Master Anji. He's a good friend of mine, and if it wasn't for him nagging me, I never would have made this video. Now then, with all the plugs out of the way, thank you to everyone who stayed till the very end. I hope you're willing to join me on whatever graces my channel next. Be it part 2 or coverage for something new. But whatever the subject of our next meeting, may the light always go with you.